In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a missing brass key unlocks a deadly secret. When Squire Thornton dies, his locked study hides a truth no one dares speak. Was it a heart attack or murder? Miss Marple, with her sharp mind and gentle smile, unravels a web of greed, betrayal, and poison. Why is the squire's nephew so nervous? What's hidden in the safe? And where is the key that could expose a killer? Dive into a mystery where every clue whispers danger and one wrong step could be fatal. Chapter 1. The village whisper's morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. The village, nestled in the folds of the English countryside, hummed with the quiet rhythm of routine milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, the baker's van rattling down the cobbled lane, and the faint chatter of sparrows in the hedgerows. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite armchair by the window, sipped her tea, her sharp eyes flitting between the garden's blooming roses and the pages of the Times. But her attention, as it often did, drifted to the pulse of the village beyond. Her gate. St. Mary Mead was a place where secrets rarely stayed buried. Its inhabitants, bound by proximity and habit, wove a tapestry of gossip that Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and keen mind, unraveled with ease. Today, her ears caught a different thread, one that tugged at her curiosity like a loose stitch in a wilkie. Knit scarf. It began at the post office, a stone's throw from her cottage, where Miss Marple had ventured to mail a letter to her nephew, Raymond. The post office, with its creaking floorboards and faded notices, was the village's unofficial hub of news. Behind the counter, Mrs. Weatherby, a stout woman with a penchant for dramatics, was in full flow, her voice carrying over the jingle of the bell above the door. "Mark my words, Lucy," she said to her assistant, a mousy girl who nodded vigorously, "that key's the talk of the town. Vanished? It has, right off the squire's watch chain, and him dead not a month." Miss Marple, pausing to adjust her gloves, tilted her head ever so slightly. The squire, Mr. Archibald Thornton, had been a prominent figure in St. Mary Mead until his sudden death 3 weeks prior. Officially, it was a heart attack his body found slumped in his study at Thornton Hall, the grand estate on the village's edge. But Mrs. Weatherby's tone suggested more than a medical tragedy. "A brass key, you say?" Lucy whispered, her eyes wide. "What's it open, then?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "That's the mystery, isn't it? They say it was for his study, locked tight since he passed. But I heard from Mrs. Bantry her maid's cousin works at the hall that the squire kept secrets in there. Papers, maybe, or something worth a fortune." Miss Marple, pretending to fuss with her stamps, noted the tremor in Mrs. Weatherby's voice. Secrets, in her experience, were rarely as grand as gossip made them out to be, but they often hid sharper truths. She paid for her stamps, offered a polite smile, and stepped out into the crisp morning air, her mind already turning over the words she'd overheard. The mention of the key intrigued her. Archibald Thornton had been a private man, genial but guarded, with a habit of patting his waistcoat where a heavy brass key dangled from a gold watch chain. Miss Marple had seen it herself at the last village fete, glinting in the sunlight as he handed out prizes for the best marrow. Its disappearance, coupled with the locked study, suggested something amiss. And then there was the matter of Roger Thornton, the squire's nephew, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead 2 days ago, stirring whispers of his own Roger. A lanky man in his 30s with a city slickness that clashed with the village's rustic charm had not been seen in St. Mary Mead for years. The squire's estrangement from his only heir was no secret. Rumors of Roger's gambling debts and reckless ventures in London had reached even Miss Marple's quiet parlor. His sudden return, so soon after the squire's death, was enough to raise eyebrows. Mrs. Weatherby had mentioned him too, noting his shifty eyes as he inquired about the estate. Miss Marple decided a visit to the village hall was in order. The hall, a quaint building with ivy-clad walls, hosted a small exhibit of local history, including photographs from Thornton Hall's glory days. If the key was as significant as the gossip suggested, perhaps a clue to its purpose lay among those faded images. The hall was quiet when she arrived, save for the soft clatter of teacups from the Women's Institute meeting in the back room. Miss Marple nodded to Mrs. Price, the hall's caretaker, who was dusting a display case filled with old medals and cricket trophies. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," she said, her voice warm but deliberate. "I thought I'd take a look at the Thornton family exhibit. Such a shame about the squire." Mrs. Price, a weary woman with a sharp tongue, set down her cloth. "Oh, Miss Marple, terrible business, that. And now that nephew of his poking about makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Does it now? I suppose Roger's return has stirred some talk." "Stirred? It's a regular tempest," Mrs. Price said, warming to the topic. "He was at the Red Lion last night, asking odd questions about the squire's habits. Wanted to know who visited the hall. What time the squire took his tea. Queer, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "Queer indeed. I'll just have a look at those photographs, if I may." The exhibit was a modest affair. A few framed pictures, a handwritten timeline of the Thornton family, and a glass case with a tarnished silver cup from a long-ago horse race. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a photograph labeled Thornton Hall, 1925. It showed a younger Archibald Thornton, stern-faced but proud, standing on the hall's steps. His hand rested on his waistcoat, where the brass key hung prominently from its chain. Catching the camera's flash like a tiny beacon, she leaned closer, her knitting bag dangling from her arm. The key was larger than she'd remembered, its head engraved with a faint pattern across, perhaps, or a crest. Beside the squire stood his wife, Eleanor, her smile strained, and a boy of about 10, presumably Roger, staring sullenly at the ground. The family's tension was palpable. Even in the grainy image, Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The key's prominence suggested it was more than a trinket, it was a symbol, perhaps of the squire's control over his estate or something hidden within it. Its disappearance, coupled with Roger's return, pointed to a deliberate act. Had it been stolen before the squire's death or after? And why was the study, of all places, still locked? Her thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the hall's door. Turning, she saw Roger Thornton himself, his overcoat slightly askew, his face pale under the brim of his hat. He froze when he saw her, then offered a tight smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I didn't expect to find you here." "Nor I you, Mr. Thornton," she replied, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. "Paying respects to your uncle's legacy," Roger's smile faltered. "Something like that. Just looking for some family history." His gaze darted to the photograph lingering on the key. Uncle Archie was fond of his keepsakes, wasn't he? "Very fond," Miss Marple said, adjusting her scarf. "That key, for instance. Quite distinctive. I believe it's gone missing." Roger's hand twitched, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. Instead, he laughed a brittle sound. "Village gossip travels fast. Yes, it's missing. Probably misplaced when they moved his body." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Of course, these things do get misplaced. Though it's curious, isn't it? How such a small thing can cause such a stir." Roger's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. excusing himself with a curt nod and striding toward the door. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand patted his coat pocket as if checking for something. A key, perhaps, or something else entirely. Mrs. Price, who had been hovering nearby, sidled up, shifty. Like I said, what's he want with old photos, eh? Memories, perhaps, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. She thanked Mrs. Price and stepped back into the sunlight, her mind piecing together the fragments of the morning, the key, the locked study. Roger's unease, it all pointed to a truth buried beneath the squire's death. A heart attack might close a man's life, but only a secret could lock a room so tightly. As she walked home, the village seemed to hum with new energy. A milkman tipped his hat, unaware of the mystery brewing in her thoughts. A group of children darted past, their laughter mingling with the distant chime of the church bell. Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She had no proof yet, only whispers and a photograph, but her instincts honed by years of observing human nature told her the key was no mere trinket. It was, quite possibly, the key to a murder dot by the time she reached her cottage. Her resolve was firm. She would visit Thornton Hall, perhaps under the guise of consoling Eleanor. The study, the key, and Roger's nervous glances were threads in a pattern she was determined to unravel. As she settled back into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple smiled to herself. The village might whisper, but she would listen, and the truth, as it always did, would come to light. Satisfying end? The photograph, with its glimpse of the key, had given her a starting point. It was a small victory, but enough to confirm her suspicion. The key's disappearance was no accident, and Roger Thornton's return was no coincidence. Tomorrow, she would call on Eleanor Thornton, and the next piece of the puzzle would surely follow. Chapter 2. The locked room. Morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, curling around the ankles of early risers like a reluctant cat. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a sensible woolen shawl, stepped lightly toward Thornton Hall, her mind buzzing with the peculiar details of the squire's death. The photograph she'd glimpsed in the village hall, the brass key, dangling from Squire Thornton's watch chain, had lodged in her thoughts like a splinter. It was no ordinary key, she was certain. Not when it unlocked a room that hadn't been open since the squire's heart supposedly gave out 3 months prior. And Roger, the squire's estranged nephew, with his fidgety hands and evasive eyes, was far too interested in that locked study for her liking. The invitation to Thornton Hall had come unexpectedly, delivered by a breathless postboy who'd caught her just as she was leaving the post office. Eleanor Thornton, the squire's widow, had penned a note in her elegant, looping script. Miss Marple, your insight is renowned. Would you do me the kindness of visiting? I am troubled by matters at the hall. It was the sort of summons that stirred Miss Marple's curiosity, not least because Eleanor, a poised woman in her late 50s, rarely admitted to being troubled. Miss Marple tucked the note into her reticule, her knitting needles clicking softly against the photograph she'd borrowed from the village hall archives, and set off. Thornton Hall loomed at the edge of the village, a Georgian pile of honey-colored stone half smothered by ivy. Its grandeur was tempered by neglect. The rose gardens were overgrown, and the fountain in the courtyard stood dry, its cherubs stained with moss. As Miss Marple approached, the heavy oak door swung open, revealing Eleanor in a somber gray dress, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple, thank you for coming, Eleanor said, her voice steady but laced with strain. I hope I haven't inconvenienced you. Not at all, Mrs. Thornton, Miss Marple replied, her eyes bright and alert behind her spectacles. A walk on a morning like this is quite invigorating, and I'm always pleased to lend an ear. Eleanor led her through a cavernous hall, adorned with portraits of stern-faced Thorntons, their eyes seeming to follow the two women. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood, and a faint chill lingered despite the fire crackling in the drawing room. They settled into high-backed chairs, and a maid, young, nervous, with a habit of glancing over her shoulder, brought tea. Miss Marple noted the maid's trembling hands as she set down the tray, the cups rattling faintly. "I'll come straight to the point," Eleanor said, stirring her tea with a silver spoon. "It's Roger. He's been insistent about the study. My husband's study. It's been locked since his passing, you see, and I haven't had the heart to open it. But Roger, he's been here barely a week, and he's asked 3 times to go inside. He says it's to retrieve family papers," but she trailed off, her fingers tightening around the spoon. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle encouragement. "And you find his insistence troubling?" Eleanor nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's not just that. He's changed since he arrived. He's jumpy, always looking over his shoulder, as if he expects someone to leap out of the shadows. And last night, I heard noises scraping, like someone tampering with a lock. It came from the study." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloging details: Roger's nervousness, the locked study, the noises in the night. "Might I see the study, Mrs. Thornton? It could help to put your mind at ease." Eleanor hesitated, then rose. "Of course. It's this way." They traversed a long corridor lined with faded tapestries, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The study door, at the far end, was a heavy slab of mahogany, its brass lock gleaming dully in the dim light. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint scratches around the keyhole's shallow, irregular marks, as if someone had fumbled with a tool or a makeshift key. She crouched slightly, adjusting her spectacles, and traced a finger over the scratches. "These are recent," she murmured, more to herself than to Eleanor. "The metal is still bright where it's been scraped." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. "Do you think someone tried to break in?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, straightening. "Or they were testing the lock, perhaps to see if a key might fit." "Has anyone else shown interest in this room?" Eleanor shook her head. "Only Roger. The staff avoid it. They say it's bad luck, that the squire's spirit lingers." "Silly nonsense." "Of course," but she shivered, glancing at the door. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Superstition often cloaks simpler truths. Might we go inside? I'd like to see what's so important to your nephew." Eleanor produced a key, not the brass one from the photograph, but a smaller, plainer one, and unlocked the door with a heavy clunk. The study was a time capsule, frozen in the moment of the squire's death. A massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a half-burned candle. Bookshelves lined the walls, their volumes sagging under dust. A single window, its curtains drawn, lit in a sliver of gray light, illuminating motes that danced in the air. The room smelled of leather and mildew, with a faint, bitter undertone. Miss Marple couldn't place. She moved to the desk, her movements precise, like a cat picking its way across a cluttered table. The papers were a mix of estate records, letters, and ledgers, but nothing immediately incriminating. Yet her attention lingered on the desk's edge, where a faint smudge of wax had hardened into a tiny ridge. She touched it, noting its reddish hue, sealing wax, perhaps from a letter or document. "Does Roger know what's in here?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. "He claims he's looking for family deeds," Eleanor replied, wringing her hands. "But my husband was private about his papers. He said the study held his legacy, whatever that meant." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. The latch was secure, but the sill bore faint scuff marks, as if someone had leaned against it heavily. She parted the curtains, revealing a view of the overgrown rose garden and, beyond it, the gardener's shed. Old Tom's story about seeing Roger near the window flickered in her mind. Has anyone else had access to this room since your husband's death? No one, Eleanor said firmly. The staff were forbidden, and I kept the key myself. Though she hesitated, her brow furrowing. Roger did ask to borrow it once, saying he needed to check something for the estate's solicitor. I refused. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. The scratches on the lock, the scuff marks on the sill, Roger's insistence, it all pointed to someone desperate to enter this room, and not through the door. She turned back to the desk, her eyes catching on a small brass paperweight shaped like a lion's head. It was heavier than it looked, and when she tilted it, a faint rattle sounded from within. She set it down carefully, deciding to ponder its significance later. Mrs. Thornton, she said, do you recall anything unusual about your husband's possessions the night he died? A key, perhaps, or a chain he wore? Eleanor frowned, her eyes distant. He always wore a watch chain with a brass key on it. He called it a keepsake, said it was from his father. I haven't seen it since that night. I assumed it was with his effects, but the undertaker never mentioned it. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face remained serene. The key from the photograph, gone from the squire's body, stolen, perhaps, in the chaos of his death. And where was he found? Here, Eleanor said, pointing to a spot near the desk. He was slumped in his chair. The doctor said it was his heart. But now, with Roger and these noises, her voice trembled, and she looked away. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. You've been very brave, my dear. I think it's best we lock this room again for now. I'd like to speak with Roger, if he's about. Eleanor nodded, her relief palpable. He's in the library, I believe. He's taken to reading there. Every morning, as they left the study, Miss Marple cast one last glance at the room, her mind cataloging its secrets, the scratches, the wax, the paperweight, the bitter smell. The squire's death was no accident. She was certain. The key, wherever it was, had been taken deliberately, and the study held answers someone was desperate to uncover or conceal. The library was a contrast to the study, warm and cluttered with overstuffed chairs and shelves groaning under the weight of novels and almanacs. Roger Thornton, a weary man in his early 30s with a perpetually furrowed brow, sat by a window, a book open in his lap, but his eyes fixed on the garden beyond. He started as Miss Marple and Eleanor entered, the book slipping slightly. Roger, Miss Marple has kindly agreed to look into our concerns, Eleanor said, her tone formal. Roger's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, wary but polite. Concerns? I'm not sure what you mean. And Eleanor. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair opposite him. Oh, just a few village whispers. Mr. Thornton, I understand you've been eager to access the squire's study. Family papers, I believe. Roger's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, deeds and such. The estate's in a muddle since Uncle's death. I thought I could help. Sort it out. Very commendable, Miss Marple said, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. Though I wonder why the study, specifically. Surely the solicitor has copies of any important documents. Roger shifted, his fingers drumming on the book. Uncle was secretive. He kept originals in the study, or so he told me. I just want to ensure nothing's overlooked. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. And the noises Mrs. Thornton heard last night near the study, you wouldn't know anything about that, I suppose. Roger's face paled, but he recovered quickly. Noises? Probably mice. This old place is full of them. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. Though mice don't usually leave scratches on locks. Tell me, Mr. Thornton, did you ever see the brass key your uncle wore? The one on his watch chain. Roger's eyes narrowed, but he shook his head. I remember it vaguely. He was fond of it, but I don't know what it opened. Why, oh, just a passing thought, Miss Marple said airily, rising. I'll leave you to your reading. Mrs. Thornton, might we take a turn in the garden? The roses are lovely, even if they're a bit wild. As they stepped outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming roses. Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. Roger's evasiveness, the scratches on the lock, the missing key, it all pointed to a deliberate act. The squire's death was no heart attack, she was certain. Someone had wanted that key, and they'd taken it from his body, perhaps in this very study. But why? And what did the study hold that was worth killing for? She paused by the gardener's shed, her eyes scanning the ground. A faint impression in the mud caught her attention, a boot print, too large for old Tom's narrow feet. She crouched, noting its depth and the tread's pattern, which matched the boots she glimpsed on Roger's feet in the library. Interesting, she murmured, straightening. Miss Marple? Eleanor asked, her voice anxious, just admiring. The roses, Miss Marple said, her smile serene. But her mind was far from flowers. The key was the linchpin, and Roger was at the heart of it. She would need to watch him closely, speak to old Tom again, and perhaps revisit that study. The scratches on the lock were a beginning, but the truth lay deeper, hidden in the shadows of Thornton Hall. As they returned to the house, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her reticule, a quiet counterpoint to the storm of thoughts in her mind. The squire's death was murder, and the key was the first thread to unravel it. She would tug gently, as she always did, until the whole tapestry came undone. Chapter 3. A gardener's talleth morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the hedgerows like a whispered secret. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her sensible woolen shawl, stepped lightly along the gravel path leading to Thornton Hall. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, scanned the village's familiar contours, the thatched roofs, the church spire piercing the fog, the post office where yesterday's curious snippet about a missing brass key had first caught her. That key, rumored to belong to the late Squire Thornton's locked study, was no mere trinket. The old photograph she'd found in the village hall, showing it dangling from the squire's watch chain, had stirred her instincts. Something was amiss, and the squire's death, officially a heart attack, was beginning to smell of something darker. Her destination was the sprawling estate of Thornton Hall, where the squire's widow, Eleanor, had invited her for tea. But Miss Marple's true purpose lay beyond polite conversation. She wanted to speak with old Tom, the estate's gardener, whose weathered hands and keen eyes missed little. Village gossip, that delicate web of half-truths and sharp observations, had carried whispers of Tom seeing something odd the night the squire died. Miss Marple trusted such whispers not as gospel, but as threads to be unraveled. The iron gates of Thornton Hall creaked as she pushed them open, her small figure dwarfed by the ancient yews lining the drive. The estate was a study in faded grandeur. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and the rose gardens, once the pride of the squire's mother, now sagged under neglect. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the study window, its heavy curtains drawn tight. That locked room, untouched since the squire's death, was the heart of this mystery. The faint scratches she'd noticed around the keyhole yesterday suggested someone had tried to force their way in or out. As she rounded the corner of the manor, she spotted old Tom near the potting shed, his gnarled hands coaxing a stubborn rosebush into shape. He was a weary man, nearing 70, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that twinkled with quiet mischief. His cap, perpetually askew, shaded a brow furrowed by years of sun and secrets. Miss Marple approached her, step soft but deliberate. "Good morning, Tom," she called, her voice carrying the warmth of familiarity. "Those roses are putting up a fight, aren't they?" Tom straightened, wiping his hands on his dirt-streaked trousers. "Mornin', Miss Marple. These old girls are stubborn, but I'll have 'em blooming yet." He tipped his cap, a gesture as automatic as breathing. "What brings you out so early? Not just to admire my pruning, I reckon." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Oh, I do admire your work, Tom, but I confess, I'm here for a bit of your wisdom. You've been at Thornton Hall longer than most, haven't you? 40 years, give or take," he said, leaning on his spade. "Seen 3 squires come and go, and more secrets than I care to count." His tone was light, but his gaze sharpened, as if he sensed the weight of her visit. She nodded, settling onto a weathered bench near the shed. "It's the squire's death that's on my mind. The village is full of talk heart attack, they say, but there's a murmur about a missing key. You were here that night, weren't you?" Tom's fingers tightened on the spade, and he glanced toward the study window, half hidden by a tangle of ivy. I was tending the late roses by the west wall. Never liked working after dusk, but the squire insisted on his gardens looking proper." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I saw summat queer that night, Miss Marple. Didn't think much of it then, but now, well, it don't sit right." Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting bag resting on her lap. "Queer, you say? Do tell, Tom. I've always found your observations remarkably clear." He shuffled, clearly torn between loyalty to the estate and the urge to unburden himself. It was young Roger, the squire's nephew. He was skulking about near the study window, just as the moon came up. Looked nervy, like a fox caught in a henhouse. Kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to catch him. "Roger," Miss Marple repeated, her tone neutral but her mind racing. Roger Thornton, the squire's estranged nephew, had arrived in St. Mary Mead just days after the death, his polished city manners at odds with the village's quiet rhythms. She'd noticed his unease at the post office, his fingers drumming on the counter as he asked about the squire's effects. "Did he see you?" Tom, nay. "I was in the shadows, trimming the hedges." He didn't linger long, just paced a bit, then slipped off toward the orchard. Tom's eyes narrowed, but that weren't the oddest part. There was a woman, too, lurking by the old oak near the gate. Had a red scarf wrapped round her head, bright as a poppy against the dark. She was watching the house, same as Roger. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her knitting bag. A red scarf. The detail was vivid, specific, the kind of clue that could unravel a knot. "A woman, you say? Did you recognize her?" Tom shook his head. "Too far off, and the light was poor. But she moved quick, like she didn't want to be seen. Disappeared into the lane soon after Roger left." He reached into his pocket, producing a small, tarnished object. "Found this the next morning, near the study window. Thought it might mean summit." He handed her a brass button, its surface etched with a faint floral pattern. Miss Marple turned it over in her palm, noting its weight and the slight dent on one edge, as if it had been torn from fabric. "This is most interesting, Tom," she said softly. "May I keep it for now? I take it. It's been weighing on me. That button. Don't know why, but it feels like trouble." Tom's voice dropped to a near whisper. The squire weren't no saint, Miss Marple. Had his secrets, he did. Talk in the village was he'd been mixed up in some shady dealings money lent to folks who couldn't pay it back. Made enemies, I reckon. Miss Marple tucked the button into her bag, her mind already weaving connections. The squire's death, the missing key, Roger's prowling, the woman in the red scarf. And now this button each was a piece of a puzzle, distinct yet part of a larger picture. You've been most helpful. Tom, if you recall anything else about that night, you'll let me know, won't you? He nodded, his expression grave. I will, miss, but you be careful. Whoever's behind this, they ain't playing games. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Oh, I'm always careful, Tom, but I do find that a bit of curiosity can shine a light on the darkest corners. As she walked back toward the village, the button nestled safely in her bag. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the woman in the red scarf. St. Mary Mead was small. Its face is familiar, yet no one she knew wore such a striking accessory. The scarf suggested an outsider, or someone hiding in plain sight, and Roger's presence by the study window was no coincidence. The scratches on the keyhole, the missing key, the squire's supposed heart attack, all pointed to a truth the village had yet to face. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair by the fire, the button glinting in the lamplight. She turned it over, her mind drifting to her niece's friend, Margaret, who'd once lost a button from her coat during a village fete. Margaret had laughed it off, but her husband, a meticulous man, had fussed over the missing piece, insisting it ruined the garment. People, Miss Marple knew, were particular about their belongings. A button torn from a coat suggested haste, struggle, or flight, and the floral pattern in common for a man's garment hinted at something more delicate. Perhaps a woman's touch, haste, struggle, or flight, and the floral pattern in common for a man's garment hinted at something more delicate. Perhaps a woman's touch. She set the button aside and reached for her knitting, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The red scarf nagged at her. It was bold, memorable, the kind of detail a careless person might overlook. She thought of Clara, the former maid dismissed by the squire for stealing. Clara, who now worked at the Blue Boar Inn, had a sharp tongue and a sharper memory. Could the scarf be hers, or was it a stranger's? Tied to the squire's murky dealings. The next morning, Miss Marple donned her best, had a sensible gray affair with a single feather, and headed to the village tea shop, a hub of gossip as reliable as the church clock. Mrs. Phipps, the proprietress, greeted her with a steaming pot of Earl Grey and a knowing smile. Morning, Miss Marple. Heard you've been poking about Thornton Hall. Anything juicy? Mrs. Phipps's eyes gleamed with curiosity. Oh, nothing much, Miss Marple said airily, stirring her tea. Just a chat with old Tom about his roses. Though I did hear mention of a red scarf seen near the hall the night the squire passed. Quite striking, I'm told. Do you know anyone fond of such a thing? Mrs. Phipps leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A red scarf, you say? Well, now, that sounds like Clara's. She wore one when she worked at the hall, always fussing with it. Said it was a gift from her mother. Haven't seen her in it lately. Mind, but she's at the Blue Boar now. Bit of a temper. That one. Since the squire let her go. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression placid, but her mind alert. Clara, you say? How interesting. I might pop by the inn for a word. She always did have a knack for noticing things. As she left the tea shop, the button in her bag seemed to grow heavier. Clara, Roger, the red scarf. The squire's secret siege thread was tightening, forming a pattern only she could see. The Blue Boar was her next stop. but she'd tread lightly. Clara, if cornered, might clam up, and Roger, well, he was no fool. But neither was Miss Jane Marple. The inn was a cozy, low-ceilinged place, its walls lined with brass tankards and faded hunting prints. Clara was behind the bar, polishing glasses with a vigor that suggested irritation. Her dark hair was pinned up, and her apron was spotless, but her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Good day, Clara," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "I was just passing and thought I'd say hello. It's been a while, hasn't it?" Clara's hands paused on the glass. "Miss Marple, didn't expect you here. What's on your mind?" Her voice was wary, but not hostile. "Oh, just a bit of village news," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool. "I was at Thornton Hall yesterday, admiring old Tom's roses. He mentioned seeing someone near the study the night the squire died. A woman with a red scarf. It made me think of you. You used to wear one, didn't you?" Clara's face paled, and the glass slipped from her hand, clattering onto the bar. I don't wear it anymore. Lost it months ago. Why's it matter?" Her words came too quickly, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "No matter at all," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Just an old woman's curiosity. Though it's odd, isn't it? How things turn up when you least expect, like this." She reached into her bag and produced the button, holding it up so the light caught its floral design. "Found near the study window. Quite pretty, don't you think?" Clara's breath hitched, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might bolt. But the younger woman steadied herself, her jaw tightening. "Don't know anything about it," she said flatly. "Lots of buttons about. Could be anyone's." "Of course," Miss Marple said, slipping the button back into her bag. "Well, I won't keep you. Do take care, Clara. And if you remember anything about that scarf, you'll let me know, won't you?" Clara nodded, her lips pressed thin. And Miss Marple left the inn, her heart quickening. Clara was frightened. That much was clear. Of what or whom remained to be seen. The button, the scarf, Roger's prowling, the squire's death. The pieces were falling into place. But the picture was still blurred dot as she walked home, the village waking around her. Miss Marple's mind churned. The button was no ordinary trinket. It matched the locket the squire wore, the one she suspected held the missing key. And Clara's fear suggested she knew more than she let on. Roger, too, was hiding something, his nervous energy betraying. A man with secrets. The red scarf was the key to unlocking the next thread, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Back in her cottage, she placed the button on her mantel, next to a vase of late-blooming roses. The fire crackled, and her knitting needles resumed their rhythm. Tomorrow, she'd visit Eleanor at Thornton Hall again. The locked study, the hidden safe, the squire's secrets, they were all waiting to be uncovered. And Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet smile and sharper mind, was just the woman to do it. Chapter 4. The red scarf-clued morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's tea shop, casting delicate patterns across the checkered tablecloths. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, a pot of Earl Grey steaming beside her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the room with her sharp, bird-like eyes. The tea shop, with its low hum of village gossip and the clink of china, was a perfect stage for uncovering secrets. Today, her mind was fixed on the red scarf old Tom had mentioned, a vivid thread in the tangled mystery of Squire Thornton's death. The bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Phipps, the postmistress, bustled in, her cheeks flushed from the autumn chill. She spotted Miss Marple and made a beeline for her table, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper before she'd even sat down. "Jane, You'll never guess what I heard, Mrs. Phipps said, adjusting her spectacles. That red scarf old Tom's been going on about. It belongs to Clara Hodges, the maid who got sacked from Thornton Hall last spring. Stealing, they said, though she swore she was innocent. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, her expression one of polite curiosity, though her mind was already racing. Clara Hodges, you say, now. That's interesting. I recall she was a quiet girl, always kept to herself. Where is she now? Mrs. Phipps leaned closer, her voice barely above the clatter of teacups. Working at the Black Boar Inn, serving tables. But mark my words, Jane, there's something odd about her. Always looking over her shoulder, like she's expecting trouble. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the button old Tom had given her, its intricate design glinting in her memory. The red scarf, the button. Roger's nervous demeanor, it was all beginning to form a pattern, though the edges were still blurry. She thanked Mrs. Phipps, who bustled off to share her gossip elsewhere, and sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of Clara. The tea shop was alive with the usual morning crowd. Farmers discussing the harvest, shopkeepers lamenting slow business, and a gaggle of young women giggling over a fashion magazine. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the far corner, where a young woman with a pale, drawn face was clearing a table. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and her movements were quick, almost furtive. Clara Hodges. Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her basket and rose, her steps light but purposeful as she approached the girl. Clara glanced up, her hazel eyes widening briefly before she schooled her expression into one of polite indifference. Good morning, Clara, Miss Marple said warmly, as if they were old acquaintances. Might I have a word? I won't keep you long. Clara hesitated, her hands tightening around the tray she held. Miss Marple, isn't it? I suppose so. Just let me finish here. Of course, Miss Marple said, settling at a nearby table and gesturing for Clara to join her when she was ready. She watched as Clara darted to the kitchen, her apron fluttering like a trapped bird. There was fear in her movements, Miss Marple noted, but also a flicker of defiance. This was no ordinary maid caught in a petty scandal. When Clara returned, she sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. What do you want to talk about, ma'am? Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle but probing. I've been hearing stories, Clara, about your time at Thornton Hall. A red scarf, in particular, seems to have caught people's attention. I wondered if you might tell me about it. Clara's face paled, and her fingers twitched toward her apron pocket before she caught herself. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice barely steady. I lost that scarf months ago. It's nothing special. Oh, I'm sure it's not, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with understanding. But you see, Clara, small things often tell big stories. Old Tom mentioned seeing someone in a red scarf near the squire's study the night he died, and I can't help but think you might know something about it. Clara's gaze dropped to the table, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might bolt, but then the girl's shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. I wasn't stealing, Miss Marple, whatever they say. The squire, he was a hard man. He accused me of taking silver, but it was a lie to get rid of me. I saw things, heard things that he didn't want anyone knowing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. What sort of things, Clara? You can tell me. I'm not here to judge. Clara glanced around the tea shop, ensuring no one was listening, then lowered her voice to a whisper. The squire was mixed up in something shady. Money. Lots of it. Going to people who didn't come through the front door. I heard him arguing with Roger one night, about papers and debts. Roger wanted something from the study, but the squire wouldn't let him near it. That's why I was there that night. I was watching for Roger. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Watching? You mean spying, don't you? For Roger Thornton. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. He paid me, Miss Marple. Not much, but enough to keep me going after I was sacked. He said he just wanted to know what the squire was hiding. I didn't think it would lead to that. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Miss Marple reached across the table, patting Clara's hand gently. You didn't think it would lead to murder, did you? Clara flinched, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. I swear, I saw the squire through the window, pacing, clutching that locket he always wore. Then he collapsed, and Roger was there, grabbing something from him. I ran before I could see more. Miss Marple's mind whirred, piecing together Clara's story with the clues she'd already gathered. The locket, the key, the scratches on the study door all pointed to a struggle, a theft, a desperate act. But Clara's fear suggested she was more than a bystander. Clara, she said softly, did you ever see what was in the squire's study? Something important, perhaps, like a safe. Clara's eyes widened, and she nodded slowly. There was a safe, hidden behind a portrait of the squire's father. I saw him open it once, when he thought I was out of the room. He kept papers in there, and something small, shiny. I didn't get a good look, but it mattered to him. He was always checking it, like he was afraid someone would take it. Miss Marple's fingers itched to examine the button in her pocket, but she kept her hands still, her smile encouraging. You've been very brave to tell me this, Clara. One last thing, did Roger ever mention a key, a brass one? Perhaps. That belonged to the squire. Clara hesitated, then nodded. He asked me about it once, said it was for the safe. I told him I didn't know where it was, but I saw the squire keep it in that locket. Roger was furious when I told him. Said he'd get it one way or another. Miss Marple sat back, her mind alight with possibilities. The red scarf was no longer just a clue. It was a thread tying Clara to Roger, and Roger to the squire's death. But there was more to uncover. Why had Roger needed the key so badly? What was in the safe that was worth killing for? And why was Clara so frightened, even now? Thank you, Clara, Miss Marple said, rising from her seat. You've been a great help. If you think of anything else, you know where to find me. Clara nodded, her expression a mix of relief and lingering fear. As Miss Marple left the tea shop, the autumn wind tugged at her shawl, and she felt a thrill of anticipation. The mystery was deepening, but she was closing in on the truth. The Black Boar Inn was a short walk from the tea shop, its weathered sign creaking in a breeze. Miss Marple decided to linger outside, observing the comings and goings. If Clara was working there, it was possible Roger or someone else connected to the case might appear. She settled on a bench across the street, her knitting in hand as a perfect excuse for loitering. The inn was busy, with travelers and locals alike passing through its heavy oak doors. Miss Marple's eyes followed each figure, her mind cataloging details: the postman's hurried gait, a farmer's muddy boots, a woman in a green coat who glanced nervously at the inn before hurrying away. Nothing stood out until, just as the church clock struck noon, a familiar figure emerged from a side alley. Roger Thornton. He was dressed in a tweed jacket, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his eyes darting around as if expecting pursuit. Miss Marple's needles slowed as she watched him pause at the... Miss Marple's mind whirred, piecing together Clara's story with the clues she'd already gathered. The locket, the key, the scratches on the study door all pointed to a struggle, a theft, a desperate act. But Clara's fear suggested she was more than a bystander. Clara, she said softly, did you ever see what was in the squire's study? Something important, perhaps, like a safe. Clara's eyes widened and she nodded slowly. There was a safe hidden behind a portrait of the squire's father. I saw him open it once, when he thought I was out of the room. He kept papers in there and something small, shiny. I didn't get a good look, but it mattered to him. He was always checking it, like he was afraid someone would take it. Miss Marple's fingers itched to examine the button in her pocket, but she kept her hands still, her smile encouraging. You've been very brave to tell me this, Clara. One last thing, did Roger ever mention a key, a brass one? Perhaps. That belonged to the squire. Clara hesitated, then nodded. He asked me about it once. Said it was for the safe. I told him I didn't know where it was, but I saw the squire keep it in the locket. Roger was furious when I told him. Said he'd get it one way or another. Miss Marple sat back, her mind alight with possibilities. The red scarf was no longer just a clue. It was a thread tying Clara to Roger, and Roger to the squire's death. But there was more to uncover. Why had Roger needed the key so badly? What was in the safe that was worth killing for? And why was Clara so frightened, even now? Thank you, Clara, Miss Marple said, rising from her seat. You've been a great help. If you think of anything else, you know where to find me. Clara nodded, her expression a mix of relief and lingering fear. As Miss Marple left the tea shop, the autumn wind tugged at her shawl, and she felt a thrill of anticipation. The mystery was deepening, but she was closing in on the truth. The Black Boar Inn was a short walk from the tea shop, its weathered sign creaking in the breeze. Miss Marple decided to linger outside, observing the comings and goings. If Clara was working there, it was possible Roger or someone else connected to the case might appear. She settled on a bench across the street, her knitting in hand as a perfect excuse for loitering. The inn was busy, with travelers and locals alike passing through its heavy oak doors. Miss Marple's eyes followed each figure, her mind cataloging details: the postman's hurried gait, a farmer's muddy boots, a woman in a green coat who glanced nervously at the inn before hurrying away. Nothing stood out until, just as the church clock struck noon, a familiar figure emerged from a side alley. Roger Thornton. He was dressed in a tweed jacket, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his eyes darting around as if expecting pursuit. Miss Marple's needles slowed as she watched him pause at the inn's entrance, then slip inside. She waited a moment, then tucked her knitting away and crossed the street, her steps silent on the cobblestones. Inside, the inn was warm and noisy, filled with the clatter of plates and the low murmur of conversation. Miss Marple spotted Roger at the bar, speaking to Clara in hushed tones. Clara's face was pale, her hands trembling as she polished a glass. Miss Marple chose a table near the back, partially hidden by a wooden pillar, and ordered a pot of tea to blend in. Roger's voice was too low to catch every word, but Miss Marple's keen ears picked up fragments. Keep quiet. No one needs to know. The key. Clara shook her head, her expression defiant, and Roger's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. She yanked it back, her voice rising just enough for Miss Marple to hear. I told you. I don't have it. Leave me alone. Roger glanced around, his face darkening, then leaned closer, his words a hissed warning Miss Marple couldn't quite catch. He tossed a few coins on the counter and strode out, leaving Clara visibly shaken. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. Roger's desperation was palpable. But why was he so certain Clara had the key? Had she lied about seeing him take it? As Clara resumed her work, Miss Marple caught her eye and offered a reassuring smile. Clara hesitated, then approached, her voice low. He's been at me all week, Miss Marple. Wants me to find that key, but I swear I don't know where it is. He thinks I took it when I ran that night. Miss Marple nodded, her tone soothing. I believe you, Clara. But tell me, did Roger ever say what was in the safe? Papers, perhaps. Or something more valuable? Clara bit her lip, glancing toward the door. He said it was his future. That's all. Something the squire owed him. But he was scared. She kept saying someone else was after it. Someone dangerous. Someone dangerous? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Did he give a name? Clara shook her head. No, but he mentioned a man with a scar. Someone he met in London. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to know. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the ledger page she'd found in the squire's library, marked with large sums. A man with a scar, shady investments, a hidden safe. This was no simple family dispute. She thanked Clara and left the inn, her thoughts turning to the button in her pocket. Its design, intricate and unusual, might hold another clue. Perhaps it wasn't just from Roger's coat, but a link to this mysterious stranger. The afternoon found Miss Marple at the village jeweler's, a cramped shop filled with ticking clocks and glittering trinkets. Mr. Grayson, the jeweler, was a weary man with a penchant for detail, perfect for Miss Marple's purposes. She produced the button, its silver surface etched with a delicate vine pattern, and watched his reaction. Goodness, Miss Marple, Mr. Grayson said, peering at it through a loupe. This is fine work, not local. I'd say it's from a London tailor, someone high-end. I've seen this pattern before, on a locket the squire brought in for repair. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The squire's locket, the one he always wore. The very same, Mr. Grayson said, nodding. Came in a few days before he died. Said it was a family heirloom, needed the clasp fixed. I noticed the button design matched the locket's engraving. Odd, though Roger Thornton came by the next day, asking if I'd seen it. Miss Marple's mind raced. The button, the locket, the key, they were all connected, and Roger was at the center. But who was the man with the scar? And what did he want with the safe? She thanked Mr. Grayson and stepped back into the crisp autumn air, her resolve hardening. The red scarf had led her to Clara, and Clara had pointed her to the safe. Now, she needed to find that locket and the key it held. As she walked back to her cottage, the village seemed quieter, the shadows longer. Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of clues, each thread weaving toward a truth she could almost see. Roger's desperation, Clara's fear, the squire's secrets, they all pointed to a murder carefully planned and a motive buried in the safe. She would need to tread carefully, for the man with the scar was still out there, and he might be watching. By the time she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple had made up her mind. Tomorrow, she would visit Thornton Hall and persuade Eleanor to open the study. The safe held the answers, and the key, wherever it was, would unlock not just its contents, but the truth behind a murder. Chapter 5. The safe's secret. Morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Thornton Hall, casting long shadows across the polished oak floor of the drawing room. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, a delicate counterpoint to the weighty silence of the house across from her. Eleanor Thornton, the squire's widow, fidgeted with the lace hem of her morning dress, her pale hands betraying a nervous energy that belied her composed exterior. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from a vase on the mantel, but it did little to ease the tension that hung between the two women. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, deceptively gentle behind her spectacles, noted every detail. The way Eleanor's fingers twisted the fabric, the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke of her late husband, and the curious glance she cast toward the locked door of the squire's study. It was that door, and the mystery of the brass key that had once opened it. That had brought Miss Marple here today. The village of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with whispers about Squire Thornton's death. Officially a heart attack, but Miss Marple's instincts told her there was more to the story. The missing key, the Squire's estranged nephew Roger, and now the locked study, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly together. Eleanor, my dear, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but deliberate, I do think it's time we took a closer look at that study. If the key is truly lost, as you say, perhaps there's another way to open the door. It's been untouched since the tragedy, hasn't it? Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know if I can bear to go in there. It was Henry's sanctuary. You see, he spent hours in that room, writing, planning. He was always so particular about keeping it locked. Even I rarely went inside. Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting pausing for a moment. And yet, Roger seems awfully keen to get in, doesn't he? I couldn't help but notice how he lingered by the door yesterday, rowling the handle as if he might will it open. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Roger, she said, her tone sharp with something akin to disdain. He's been nothing but trouble since he arrived. Always asking about Henry's papers, his investments, his will. I don't trust him, Miss Marple. Not one bit. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding, though her mind was already turning over the possibilities. Roger's insistence on searching the study, the scratches she had observed around the keyhole during her discreet inspection the previous day, and now Eleanor's unease, it all pointed to something hidden within that locked room. Something worth killing for. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, setting her knitting aside and rising with a sprightliness that belied her age. We should put our minds at ease. If there's nothing to find, then opening the study will do no harm. And if there is something, well, better we know what it is before Roger does, don't you think? Eleanor hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. Very well. But the key, it's gone. Henry always kept it on his watch chain, and after he passed, it wasn't with his things. I don't know how we'll get in. Miss Marple's smile was small but reassuring. Leave that to me, my dear. I've found that locked doors have a way of revealing their secrets, given a little patience. The study door loomed at the end of a dimly lit corridor, its dark wood panels gleaming under the flicker of a single wall sconce. Miss Marple stood before it, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy oak, while Eleanor hovered nervously behind her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, had been summoned to bring the estate's spare keys, but none had fit the lock. Miss Marple, undeterred, knelt to examine the keyhole more closely, her fingers tracing the faint scratches she had noticed before. These marks, she murmured, almost to herself, are quite fresh, aren't they? Someone has tried to force this lock, and not so long ago. Eleanor gasped softly. You don't think, Roger? Miss Marple straightened, her eyes bright with interest. It's possible, but let's not jump to conclusions. First, we must get inside. Mrs. Gibbs, would you be so kind as to fetch Mr. Harrow from the village? He's a locksmith, I believe, and a discreet one at that. Double quotes Mrs. Gibbs, a stout woman, with a no-nonsense air, nodded and bustled off, leaving Miss Marple and Eleanor alone in the corridor. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant tick of a grandfather clock. Miss Marple used the moment to study Eleanor, noting the way her gaze darted toward the study door, as if she both longed and dreaded to see what lay beyond it. Eleanor, Miss Marple said gently, while we wait, perhaps you could tell me more about Henry's habits in this room. Did he ever mention what he kept here? Papers, perhaps, or something more personal? Eleanor's hands clasped together, her knuckles whitening. He was always writing, letters, accounts, that sort of thing. He said it was business, but he never shared the details with me. Lately, though, he was different. Secretive. He'd spend hours in there, and when I asked, he'd just say he was setting things right. I thought he meant the estate. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Setting things right. She repeated, an interesting choice of words. And did he mention his will at all? I understand he was revising it before his death. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. He did mention it, yes. He said he wanted to make sure everything was in order, especially after his falling out with Roger. But he didn't tell me what he changed, only that it was important. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. The squire's will, the locked study, the missing key, it was all beginning to form a picture, though the edges remained frustratingly blurred. She was about to press further when Mrs. Gibbs returned, accompanied by Mr. Harrow, a weary man with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Miss Marple, Mr. Harrow said, tipping his cap. Heard you've got a stubborn lock on your hands. Let's see what I can do. He set to work, his tools clinking softly as he probed the keyhole. Miss Marple watched with keen interest, noting the precision of his movements. Within minutes, there was a satisfying click, and the door swung inward, revealing the study in all its shadowed mystery. The room was a time capsule, untouched since Squire Thornton's death 3 weeks prior. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the heavy curtains, illuminating a large mahogany desk cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a leather-bound ledger. Bookshelves lined the walls, their shelves sagging under the weight of tomes on history, law, and agriculture. A portrait of the squire himself hung above the fireplace, his stern gaze seeming to follow Miss Marple as she stepped inside. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, her hand gripping the doorframe. It feels wrong being here, she whispered. Like we're trespassing. Nonsense, my dear, Miss Marple said briskly, though her tone was kind. This is your home, and we're only seeking the truth. Now, let's have a look around, shall we? She moved to the desk, her eyes scanning the scattered papers. Most were mundane bills, correspondence with tenants, notes on crop yields, but one item caught her attention. A single sheet of paper, tucked beneath the ledger, bearing the squire's distinctive scrawl. She lifted it carefully, her heart quickening as she read the words. The key to my heart unlocks my legacy. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. How very poetic, she murmured, and rather cryptic. Don't you think, Eleanor? Eleanor peered over her shoulder, her brow furrowing. What does it mean? Henry wasn't one for riddles. He was far too practical. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her mind racing. But people often hide their deepest truths in plain sight. Tell me, did Henry wear anything special? A locket, perhaps, or a piece of jewelry he was particularly fond of? Eleanor's eyes widened. A locket, yes. He always wore a small gold locket on a chain around his neck. He said it was a gift from his mother, though I never saw him open it. Do you think, could the key be inside? Miss Marple's smile deepened. It's certainly possible. And if that locket is missing, as I suspect it is, then we may have found the reason someone was so eager to remove it from his body. She turned her attention to the portrait above the fireplace, her gaze lingering on the squire's painted likeness. In the image, he stood in this very room, one hand resting on the desk, the other clutching a watch chain. But there, glinting faintly in the artist's rendering, was the locket, a small, oval shape hanging just below his collar. Eleanor, Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with excitement. Would you say this portrait is accurate? The locket. I mean, was it as prominent as it appears here? Eleanor stepped closer, studying the painting. Yes, it's exactly as I remember it. He never took it off, not even to sleep. But after he died, I didn't think to look for it. There was so much confusion, and the doctor was so quick to call it a heart attack. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the clues. The key, the locket. The scratches on the locket all suggested that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the study remained sealed. And if the locket held the key, as she now suspected, then its disappearance was no accident. Her eyes drifted to the wall behind the portrait, where a faint irregularity in the paneling caught her attention. She stepped closer, running her fingers along the wood until she felt a slight give. With a gentle push, a small section of the panel swung inward, revealing a concealed safe embedded in the wall. Eleanor gasped. I had no idea that was there. Henry never mentioned a safe. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet satisfaction. Your husband was a man of secrets, it seems. And this safe, I suspect, holds the answers we've been looking for. But without the key, she trailed off, her mind already turning to the next step. The locket was the key both literally and figuratively, and finding it would unlock not only the safe, but the truth about Squire Thornton's death, Roger's nervous demeanor, Clara's fear. The mysterious woman in the red scarf all were threads in a tapestry that was slowly coming into focus. Eleanor, Miss Marple said, turning to the younger woman, I think it's time we paid a visit to the village jeweler. If Henry's locket was as important as it seems, someone may have seen it or repaired it before it vanished. And I have a feeling that trail will lead us straight to the heart of this mystery. Eleanor nodded, her earlier reluctance giving way to a flicker of determination. You're right, Miss Marple. If there's something to find, I want to know what it is, for Henry's sake. Miss Marple gathered her shawl and hat, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. As they left the study, she cast one last glance at the safe, its iron door a silent challenge. The key to my heart, she thought. A romantic notion, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead, even the most sentimental clues could unlock a murder. The village of St. Mary Mead was alive with the hum of late morning, the cobbled streets bustling with villagers going about their daily tasks. Miss Marple and Eleanor made their way to the jeweler's shop, a quaint establishment tucked between the butcher and the bakery. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and Mr. Phipps, the jeweler, looked up from his workbench, his magnifying glass perched comically on his forehead. Mrs. Thornton and Miss Marple. What a pleasant surprise, he said, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity. What brings you here today? Miss Marple smiled, her demeanor as disarming as ever. Oh, just a small matter, Mr. Phipps. I understand you. Repaired a locket for Squire Thornton not long before his passing. A gold one, perhaps, with an intricate design. Mr. Phipps's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The Squire's locket. Yes, I remember it well. He brought it in about a month ago. Said the clasp was loose. I fixed it up and returned it to him the next day. Why do you ask? Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low and confidential. I'm trying to trace its whereabouts. You see, it seems to have gone missing after his death. And I have reason to believe it may be significant. Double quotes. Mr. Phipps hesitated, then lowered his voice to match hers. Well, I don't like to speak out of turn, but Roger Thornton came by a few days after the Squire's death, asking about that very locket. Said it was a family heirloom, and he was keen to recover it. I told him I hadn't seen it since I repaired it, but he was awfully persistent. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Persistent, you say? And did he mention anything else about it? Perhaps what was inside? Mr. Phipps shook his head. He didn't say, and I didn't ask. But I did notice something odd about the locket when I worked on it. The squire was particular about not letting me open it, but I could tell it was heavier than you'd expect for a simple keepsake, almost as if it held something metal inside. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Eleanor, whose face had grown pale. "Thank you, Mr. Phipps," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but firm. "You've been most helpful." As they stepped back into the sunlight, Eleanor clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Do you really think the key is in the locket, and that Roger took it?" "I think it's very likely," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but resolute. "And if Roger has the locket, then he has the key not just to the safe, but to whatever secret your husband was protecting. We must find it, Eleanor, before he does something rash." The two women walked back toward Thornton Hall, the weight of their discovery settling over them. For Miss Marple, the pieces were falling into place, each clue a step closer to the truth. The locket, the key, the safe, they were all linked. And at the heart of it was a motive that had driven someone to murder. As the church bells chimed noon, she felt a familiar thrill. The quiet certainty that she was closing in on the answer. And in St. Mary Mead, no secret could stay hidden for long, not from Jane Marple. Chapter 6. The locket's trail of morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's modest cottage. She sat at her breakfast table, a delicate teacup in hand, her sharp eyes fixed on the tarnished button old Tom had given her. It was no ordinary button. Its intricate filigree, shaped like a tiny rose, matched the description of the squire's missing locket. The connection was no coincidence, she was certain. Her mind, ever restless with curiosity, churned through the threads of the mystery, the brass key, the squire's death, Roger's nervous inquiries, and now this button, a tangible clue linking past and present. Miss Marple set the button down and reached for her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles soothing her thoughts. She had learned from the village grapevine that the squire's locket, a family heirloom, had been repaired at Mr. Grayson's jewelry shop just days before his death. Roger's interest in it, as Clara had hinted, was no mere sentimentality. The locket, she suspected, was the key to my heart mentioned in the squire's cryptic note, a clue that might unlock not just the safe but the truth behind his murder. Today, she would visit Mr. Grayson and trace the locket's trail. She donned her tweed coat and straw hat, tucking the button into her handbag. The walk to the village square was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. St. Mary Mead buzzed with its usual quiet charm. Mrs. Price at the bakery waved, her apron dusted with flour. Young Tommy Pierce pedaled by, delivering newspapers with a cheerful whistle. Yet beneath the village's serene surface, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, as if the squire's death had stirred shadows that refused to settle. Grayson's shop, tucked between the butcher and the tea room, was a relic of another era. Its faded sign read Grayson and Son, jewelers since 1890. Though the son had long since moved to London, the bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, greeted by the musty scent of polished wood and the soft tick of a grandfather clock. Mr. Grayson, a weary man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his workbench, where he was tinkering with a pocket watch. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "Not often I see you in my shop." Looking for something special, Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Not quite, Mr. Grayson. I'm here about a locket Squire Thornton's. To be precise, I understand you repaired it recently, Mr. Grayson's hands paused, the tiny screwdriver hovering. "The squire's locket, yes. I worked on it not a week before he passed. Poor man. A fine piece, that locket gold, with a rose filigree border. The clasp was loose, so I tightened it. He frowned, adjusting his spectacles. Why do you ask? She produced the button from her handbag, holding it up to the light. I found this near Thornton Hall. It's rather distinctive, wouldn't you say? Could it be from the same locket? Mr. Grayson took the button, turning it over with practiced fingers. His brow furrowed. Well, I'll be. It's not just similar, it's identical to the locket's design. The squire had me craft a set of buttons to match it years ago, for a waistcoat he wore to special occasions. But this one's tarnished, like it's been out in the elements. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Fascinating. And did anyone else inquire about the locket? Perhaps the squire's nephew, Roger, Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. As a matter of fact, yes. Roger Thornton came in the day after I repaired it, said it was a family heirloom, and he wanted to know if the squire had left it with me. Seemed awfully keen, though I told him the squire had already collected it. He didn't seem pleased. Did he say why he was so interested? Miss Marple asked, her tone light but probing. Said it was sentimental. Belonged to his mother or some such. But I've known Roger since he was a lad. He's not the sentimental type. Mr. Grayson leaned closer, lowering his voice. Between you and me, Miss Marple, he seemed more anxious than nostalgic. Kept glancing out the window, like he was worried someone was watching. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Roger's anxiety suggested he knew the locket's significance perhaps, that it held the brass key to the safe. And the locket itself, did you notice anything unusual about it when you repaired it? Mr. Grayson rubbed his chin. Well, now that you mention it, there was something odd. The squire asked me to check the hinge, said it was sticking. When I opened it, I saw it was hollow, with a little compartment inside. Nothing in it, mind you, but it was made to hold something small, a key, maybe, or a note. I didn't think much of it at the time. A compartment, Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. The squire's note had been no metaphor. The locket was indeed the key to my heart. If Roger had taken it, as Clara's story suggested, he likely had the key and the motive to keep its contents hidden. Thank you, Mr. Grayson. You've been most helpful. As she stepped back into the bustling square, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Thornton Hall. The locket was missing, likely stolen the night of the squire's death. Roger's interest in it, coupled with the button found near the study window, pointed to his presence at the scene. But why take the locket and leave the key behind? Or had he lost it in his haste? She needed to confirm the locket's absence from the hall and whether anyone else had seen it. Her next stop was Thornton Hall, where Eleanor Thornton had invited her for tea. The manor loomed at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls and gabled roofs a testament to centuries of Thornton wealth. Eleanor greeted her at the door, her face pale but composed, her dark hair swept into a neat bun. Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. I'm afraid the house feels so empty without Henry. Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. I can only imagine, my dear. But I've come to ask about something specific, your husband's locket. The gold one with the rose design. Have you seen it since his passing? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. The locket. Oh, Henry never took it off. It was a gift from his mother, you know. He wore it every day, even to bed. But she hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. When they prepared his body, it wasn't there. I assumed it was misplaced in the chaos, but I haven't found it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting Eleanor's unease. And did Roger ever mention it? He seems to have an interest in family heirlooms. Eleanor's lips tightened. Roger, he's been poking about the house, asking about Henry's things. He even went through the study, though I told him it's locked. He said he was looking for papers, but I don't trust him. He's changed since he left for London harder, somehow. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. Roger's behavior suggested he was hunting for the locket, knowing it held the key to the safe and perhaps the new will that threatened his inheritance. But Eleanor's nervousness hinted at something more. Was she hiding her own secrets, or merely afraid of her nephew? As they chatted, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the mantel, where a photograph of the squire stood. He was a stern man, his mustache neatly trimmed, the locket glinting at his chest. Beside it was a small brass dog figurine, its surface etched with a faint rose pattern. Her breath caught. Eleanor, that figurine isn't part of a set. Eleanor followed her gaze. Oh, that, yes, it's one of a pair Henry kept in his study. The other went missing ages ago. He was fond of them, said they reminded him of his old hound. Brutus. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The rose pattern matched. The button and locket. Could the figurine be another clue? She made a mental note to inspect the study later. For now, she needed to keep Eleanor talking. Tell me, did Henry ever mention a key? Perhaps one kept in the locket Eleanor's cup clattered against. Its saucer. A key, no. He never said anything about that. But he was secretive about his study, always locking it, even from me. He said it was for my protection, but I never understood why. Miss Marple patted her hand. You've been through so much, my dear. I'll not trouble you further today. But if you find that locket, or anything else, do let me know. As she left Thornton Hall, the weight of the mystery settled over her. The locket was gone, likely taken by Roger, and its compartment was the perfect size for the brass key. The button placed him at the scene, and the figurine suggested another piece of the puzzle lay in the study. But the squire's secrecy and Eleanor's fear hinted at deeper motives. Was the squire protecting his wife, or hiding something from her? Back in the village, Miss Marple decided to visit the churchyard where the squire was buried. The late afternoon light bathed the gravestones in a soft glow, and she found his plot easily, marked by a simple granite stone. Kneeling, she examined the ground, half hoping to find another clue. Instead, she noticed fresh footprints in the damp earthmen's boots by the size, and recent. Someone had been here, perhaps mourning, perhaps searching. As she stood, a shadow fell across the grave. Turning, she saw old Tom, his weathered face somber. Miss Marple, didn't expect to see you here. Paying respects in a way, she said, smiling. Tom, you've worked at the hall for years. Did you ever see the squire's locket? Or perhaps a matching brass figurine? Tom scratched his chin. The locket, always on him. Never saw what was inside, though. As for the figurine, there was a pair in the study, like you said. One went missing, but I found something odd the other day near the rose garden, where I found that button. A bit of gold chain, like it broke off something. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A chain. Could you show me where? Tom led her to the rose garden behind Thornton Hall, where the air was heavy with the scent of blooms. He pointed to a patch of earth near a thorny bush. Right there, caught in the soil. Thought it was rubbish at first. She knelt, her fingers brushing the dirt. There, glinting faintly, was a fragment of gold chain. Its links delicate, but snapped. It matched the locket's description perfectly. Tom, you're a treasure. This could be very important. As they parted, Miss Marple's mind word. The chain confirmed the locket had been at the hall, likely torn off during a struggle. Roger's presence near the study window. The button, the chain all pointed to him, but the figurine nagged at her. Why had one gone missing, and why did the squire value them so? She resolved to return to the study, with Eleanor's permission to search for answers. That evening, as the village settled into twilight, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the button and chain on her table. She closed her eyes, letting the pieces fall into place. Roger had sought the locket, knowing it held the key. The button placed him at the scene, the chain suggested a struggle, and the figurine hinted at another secret. The squire's death was no accident, and the locket was the key literally and figuratively to unlocking the truth. She opened her eyes, her resolve firm. Tomorrow, she would search the study and confront Roger. The trail of the locket was leading her closer to the heart of the mystery, and she would follow it to its end, no matter where it led. Chapter 7. A midnight shadowed night air hung heavy over Thornton Hall, its sprawling silhouette etched against a moonless sky. Miss Marple, ensconced in a guest room at the widow Eleanor's reluctant invitation, lay awake, her knitting needles silent on the bedside table. The house creaked with the weight of its secrets, each groan of ancient widow whisper of the past. She had accepted Eleanor's offer to stay not out of necessity, but strategy proximity to the scene of Squire Thornton's death offered insights no village tea shop could provide. The squire's locked study, the missing brass key, the cryptic locket, and now the whispers of shady investments swirled in her mind like leaves caught in an autumn gust. It was nearing midnight when a faint sound broke her reverie, a soft, deliberate tread, not the careless shuffle of a servant or the hesitant step of Eleanor. Miss Marple's senses sharpened. She slipped from her bed, her movements silent as a cat's, and donned her shawl. The hall beyond her door was a cavern of shadows, lit only by the faint glow of a single wall sconce. The sound came again, a muted thud, then the creak of a floorboard from the direction of the library. Just beyond the grand staircase, she moved with practiced care, her slippers whispering against the polished oak. The library, she knew, housed Squire Thornton's collection of rare books and ledgers, a treasure trove of his financial dealings. If someone was there at this hour, it was no idle errand. Miss Marple paused at the top of the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the banister, and listened. The tread resumed, now accompanied by the faint rustle of paper. Someone was searching. Descending the stairs, she avoided the third step from the bottom, known to squeak like a betrayed confidant. The library doors, heavy oak carved with ivy motifs, stood slightly ajar. A sliver of lamplight spilled into the hall, flickering as a shadow moved within. Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, her heart steady, but her mind alight with possibilities. Was it Roger, the squire's nephew, whose nervous demeanor and missing coat button had already marked him as a suspect? Or perhaps Clara, the former maid with the red scarf, whose fear had hinted at deeper involvement? Or could it be someone else entirely, a figure yet to emerge from the village's tapestry of secrets? She eased closer, peering through the gap. The library was a vast room, its walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to a coffered ceiling. A single oil lamp burned on a mahogany desk, casting long shadows that danced across the spines of leather-bound volumes. A figure, cloaked in darkness, stood at the far end, rifling through a shelf. The person's back was to her, their movements quick but cautious, as if aware of the house's wakeful silence. Miss Marple noted the glint of something metallic in their handbell letter opener, perhaps, or a tool for prying open locked drawers. She considered her options. Confronting the intruder alone was unwise. Thornton Hall was remote, and help was not a shout away. Yet retreating risked losing a vital clue. She scanned the hall for a tool of her own and spotted a heavy brass candlestick on a nearby table. It was no weapon, but it lent her a small measure of confidence. Holding it close, she slipped through the door, her presence as unobtrusive as a draft. The figure paused, head tilting as if sensing a change in the air. Miss Marple froze, her breath shallow. The intruder resumed, pulling a ledger from the shelf and flipping through its pages with urgency. She edged closer, using a tall armchair for cover. The ledger's pages crackled, and she caught a glimpse of neat columns of numbers, sums far larger than a country squire's estate should warrant. Investments, perhaps, or debts. The squire's cryptic note about the key to my heart and the missing locket loomed in her mind. Could this ledger hold the motive for his murder? Suddenly, the figure stiffened, slamming the ledger shut. They turned, and Miss Marple ducked behind the chair, her heart giving a single, sharp thud. The lamp's light caught the intruder's profile for a fleeting moment, a sharp jaw, a glint of spectacles. Not Roger, whose boyish features she knew well, nor Clara, whose slight frame would be unmistakable. This was someone new, a man, judging by the breadth of his shoulders. He moved toward the desk, his steps hurried, and began searching its drawers. Tossing aside papers with reckless haste. Miss Marple's mind raced. The ledger was the key. She needed to see it, but the intruder's urgency suggested he might not linger. She weighed her next move, then, with a boldness born of necessity, stepped into the light. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm but firm, as if greeting a neighbor over tea. "Might I ask what brings you to the library at this hour?" The man spun, the letter opener flashing in his hand. His face, now fully visible, was unfamiliar, angular, with a neatly trimmed beard and spectacles that magnified his startled eyes. He was perhaps 40, dressed in a dark coat that looked out of place in the rural quiet of St. Mary Mead. Who are you?" he stammered, clutching the ledger to his chest. "Jane Marple," she replied, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. "A guest of Mrs. Thornton. And you, sir, seem to be making free with her late husband's belongings." He hesitated, his gaze darting to the door. I'm a business associate of the squire's. I have every right to be here at midnight without so much as a by your leave." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, the candlestick still in her hand, its weight a quiet reassurance. "Perhaps you'd care to explain what you're seeking in that ledger. It seems terribly important." The man's lips tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. Instead, he set the ledger on the desk, his movements deliberate. "It's a private matter. Investments. Debts owed to me. You wouldn't understand." "Oh, I understand more than you might think," she said, stepping closer. "For instance, I understand that Squire Thornton's death was no heart attack, and that ledger might tell us why someone wanted him dead." His eyes widened, and she saw the flicker of fear she'd hoped for. "You're meddling in things that don't concern you," he snapped, but his voice trembled. He edged toward the door, and Miss Marple knew she had seconds to act. "Before you go," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "might I have your name? It's only polite, given we're sharing such a late hour." He glared, then muttered, "Henry Vale, and you do well to stay out of my way." With that, he shoved past her, the ledger still on the desk, and fled into the hall. She heard his footsteps fade, then the distant slam of a door. Miss Marple exhaled, setting the candlestick down. She approached the desk, her fingers brushing the ledger's worn cover. It was heavier than it looked, its pages thick with entries. She opened it, her eyes scanning the columns. Sums in the thousands, names of companies she didn't recognize, and cryptic notations: Crimson Venture, Shadow Trust, payment due urgent. One entry caught her eye, A payment of £10,000 to HV, dated the day before the squire's death. Henry Vale. Perhaps she turned the page, and a single sheet slipped free, torn at the edge. It was a letter, half finished, in the squire's precise hand, to whom it may concern. I have uncovered discrepancies in the Crimson Venture accounts. I suspect foul play and intend to confront. The words stopped abruptly, the tears slicing through the sentence. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This was no mere ledger. It was a map to the squire's murder. She tucked the torn page into her sleeve, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. Henry Vale was no villager, yet he knew exactly where to look. His presence suggested a wider web, one that stretched beyond St. Mary Mead to the murky world of the squire's investments. The locket, the key, the ledger, all were threads in a tapestry of greed and betrayal. But who was Henry Vale, and why risk exposure tonight? The house was silent now, the intruder gone. But Miss Marple knew better than to linger. She closed the ledger, memorizing its position on the desk, and slipped back to her room. The torn page burned in her sleeve, a clue she would guard until morning. As she settled into bed, the candlestick returned to its table. She allowed herself a small smile. The night had yielded more than she'd hoped to name, a motive, and a shadow that refused to stay hidden. The next morning, Thornton Hall stirred with the subdued bustle of a household in mourning. Miss Marple joined Eleanor for breakfast in the dining room, a cavernous space with portraits of Thornton ancestors glaring down from the walls. Eleanor, pale and drawn, pushed her toast about her plate. "Did you sleep well, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Well enough, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "Though I did hear some curious noises in the night. This old house does carry on, doesn't it?" Eleanor's fork paused. "Noises? I heard nothing. Perhaps the wind." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. Sipping her tea, she observed Eleanor's trembling hands, the faint shadows under her eyes. The widow knew more than she let on, but fear held her tongue. Miss Marple decided not to press not yet. Instead, she turned the conversation to the village, mentioning the upcoming fair and the jeweler who'd repaired the squire's locket. Eleanor's reaction was subtle but telling, a slight stiffening. A glance toward the window. After breakfast, Miss Marple excused herself and made for the village. The torn page, now hidden in her knitting bag, demanded investigation. She stopped first at the post office, where Mrs. Cleary, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual zeal. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Cleary chirped. "Heard anything more about that key?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But I wonder if you've heard of a Mr. Henry Vale. A business sort, perhaps passing through." Mrs. Cleary's brow furrowed. "Vale? Can't say I have. But there was a stranger at the inn last week. Kept to himself. Wore spectacles, bit of a beard. Asked about the squire's business, or so the barmaid said." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "Thank you, Mrs. Cleary. Most helpful." She left the post office, her steps brisk despite her age. The inn was her next stop, a squat building with ivy clinging to its walls. The barmaid, a rosy-cheeked girl named Polly, was wiping down tables when Miss Marple entered. "Polly, dear," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair as if for a cozy chat. "I hear you had a guest recently, a Mr. Vale. Did he mention anything of interest?" Polly hesitated, then leaned closer. "He was odd, miss. Kept asking about the squire's deals. Said he was owed money. Left in a hurry 2 nights ago. Didn't even settle his bill proper." "Did he say where he was going?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes gentle but probing. "London, I think," Polly said. mentioned a train. But he left a book behind, some sort of financial thing, full of numbers. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Might I see it, dear? Polly fetched a slim volume from behind the bar, its cover marked with coffee stains. It was a pocket ledger, its pages filled with transactions mirroring those in the squire's ledger. One entry stood out: Crimson Venture, £10,000, HV to confirm. Miss Marple thanked Polly and slipped the ledger into her bag, her mind racing. Henry Vale was no mere associate. He was a player in the squire's shadowy dealings, and his midnight search suggested he feared exposure. Back at Thornton Hall, Miss Marple retired to her room to study her finds. The torn letter and the pocket ledger painted a damning picture. Squire Thornton had stumbled onto fraud in his investments, likely orchestrated by Vale. The squire's confrontation, hinted at in the letter, had cost him his life. But how had the poison been administered, and where was the locket with its precious key? She spread her knitting across her lap, her fingers moving automatically as her mind worked. Roger's missing button, Clara's confession of spying, and now Vale's intrusion formed a triangle of motive and opportunity. Yet something nagged at her, a detail overlooked, a connection unmade. She recalled the squire's dog, its collar possibly hiding the key. Could Vale have known about it? Or was there another guardian, as the vicar's letter had suggested? As dusk fell, Miss Marple resolved to return to the library. The ledger remained on the desk, untouched since Vale's flight. She needed to cross-reference its entries with the pocket ledger to trace the money and the motive. Slipping downstairs, she found the library empty, the lamp still burning low. She opened the squire's ledger, her eyes scanning the pages. The sums were staggering. The companies obscure. Crimson Venture appeared repeatedly, linked to payments to HV, and others with initials she didn't recognize. A noise at the door made her pause. Eleanor stood there, her face pale as moonlight. Miss Marple, what are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling. Merely satisfying an old woman's curiosity, Miss Marple said, closing the ledger. This house holds many secrets, Eleanor. I believe you know some of them. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for any of this, she whispered. He was difficult, but I loved him. I didn't know about the money. Not really. Miss Marple rose, her voice gentle. Tell me what you know, my dear. It's the only way to find peace. Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. He was changing his will, she said, cutting Roger out and others. He said he'd found something wrong, something dangerous. He wouldn't tell me more. Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place. And the locket. Did he mention it? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. He said it held the key to everything. I thought he meant me, but it was something else, wasn't it? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Something worth killing for, as Eleanor wept. Miss Marple's mind turned to Henry Vale. His name, his ledger, his fear all pointed to a man desperate to cover his tracks. The torn page, the missing locket, the poisoned tea was close, so close, to unraveling the truth. Tomorrow, she would visit the jeweler again, and perhaps the vicar. The village fair loomed, a chance to spot Vale or the key itself. For now, she returned to her room, the ledgers and the torn page hidden in her knitting bag, her resolve as firm as the oak beneath Thornton Hall's ancient roof. Chapter 8. The nephew's Alibithi morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, curling around the ankles of early risers who shuffled toward the village square. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted slightly against the damp breeze, walked with purpose toward Thornton Hall. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a deceptive emblem of her quiet demeanor. for within her mind churned a whirl of observations and suspicions. The button she had found near the study window, tarnished but distinct with its engraved crest, weighed heavily in her pocket. It was a small thing, yet in Miss Marple's experience, small things often unraveled great mysteries. The previous night's discovery of the torn ledger page had set her thoughts ablaze. The squire's shady investments, hinted at by those scrawled figures, suggested a motive far darker than village gossip could fathom. Roger, the squire's estranged nephew, was at the heart of her inquiries now. His nervous demeanor, his insistence on searching the locked study, and now this button to perfectly match to the one missing from his coat, pointed to a man with secrets. Yet, Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. A man like Roger, slippery as he seemed, would not be caught by assumptions alone. She needed evidence, and today she intended to confront him. Thornton Hall loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls glowing faintly in the morning light. The estate, once a beacon of the squire's wealth, now felt like a mausoleum, its grandeur overshadowed by the specter of death. Eleanor, the squire's widow, had invited Miss Marple for tea, a polite gesture that masked her unease. Miss Marple suspected Eleanor knew more than she let on, but it was Roger who held her focus now. She climbed the stone steps and rang the bell, her keen eyes scanning the windows above for any flicker of movement. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Havers, the housekeeper, her face a map of worry lines. "Miss Marple, good morning," she said, her voice tight. "Mrs. Thornton is in the drawing room. Mr. Rogers there too, though he's in a mood." "Thank you, Mrs. Havers," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but probing. "A mood, you say? Is he often so?" Mrs. Havers hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "He's been pacing since dawn, muttering about papers and such. I don't like it, miss. This house hasn't been right since the squire passed." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the housekeeper's unease. "Grief does strange things," she said, though her mind whispered, or guilt. She followed Mrs. Havers through the oak-paneled hall, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. The air carried the faint scent of wax polish and old books, undercut by something sharper tension, perhaps, or fear. The drawing room was a study in contrasts. Elegant velvet drapes framed tall windows, but the fire in the grate sputtered weakly, as if reluctant to warm the chill within. Eleanor sat on a brocade sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her pale blue dress, though finely tailored, hung loosely on her frame, a testament to the strain of recent weeks. Roger stood by the mantel, one hand gripping a crystal decanter, the other raking through his dark hair. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, barely 30, with sharp features and eyes that darted like a cornered fox. His navy coat, she noted, was impeccably pressed, but one button on the cuff was indeed missing, the thread ends frayed. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, rising with a forced smile. "How kind of you to come. Would you like tea?" "Thank you, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair. Her eyes flicked to Roger, who barely acknowledged her, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought it a good day to discuss certain matters." Roger's head snapped up. "Matters?" His voice was sharp, almost accusatory. "What matters could an old lady possibly have with us?" Eleanor flinched, but Miss Marple's smile remained serene. "Oh, I find that village life is full of little puzzles," she said lightly. "For instance, I've been thinking about your uncle's study. Such a curious thing. That locked room. And the key brass, wasn't it? Quite distinctive." Roger's fingers tightened around the decanter, the crystal catching the light. "What's that got to do with anything?" he asked, his tone defensive. The key's gone. Everyone knows that. Gone, yes, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but deliberate. Yet I wonder where it went, and when. She reached into her pocket, producing the tarnished button and holding it up. The engraved Cresta lion rampant glinted faintly. This was found near the study window. Quite a fine button, don't you think? It reminds me of one I saw on a coat not long ago. Eleanor gasped, her eyes darting to Roger's sleeve. He froze, his face paling, then recovered with a forced laugh. Buttons fall off all the time. Miss Marple, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, tucking the button away. But molehills can hide deep burrows. I understand you were in London the night your uncle died. A train ticket, I believe, confirms it. Roger's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, I was at a meeting with some investors. Left on the 6:15 train, back the next morning. You can check the stubs if you like. Oh, I'm sure they're in order, Miss Marple said, her tone disarmingly gentle. But I do wonder about those investors. Your uncle's ledger such large sums and such secrecy. Did you know about his financial dealings? Roger set the decanter down with a clink, his eyes narrowing. What are you implying? My uncle was a private man. His business was his own. Of course, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she pulled her knitting from her bag. The rhythmic motion seemed to unsettle Roger further. Yet privacy can breed suspicion. That ledger page I found torn. Mind you suggested investments that might not have been entirely above board. Were you involved? Perhaps Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. Miss Marple, please. Rogers had a difficult time. He and my husband weren't close, but he's family. Family, yes, Miss Marple said, her eyes never leaving Roger. Which makes it all the more curious. Family often knows more than they let on. Tell me, Roger, what brought you back to St. Mary Mead so soon after your uncle's death? Roger's lips pressed into a thin line. I came to pay my respects, he said curtly, and to settle some estate matters. Is that a crime? Not at all, Miss Marple said, her needles pausing. But searching a locked study at midnight, well, that's a bit unusual, wouldn't you say? The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Eleanor's eyes widened, and Roger's face flushed a deep red. You've been spying on me, he demanded, stepping forward. What right have you to poke your nose into my affairs? No spying, my dear, Miss Marple said calmly. Just observation. An old lady like me has little else to do but notice things. Like the way you avoid questions about that ledger. Or why your coat is missing a button that matches one found where it shouldn't be. Roger's hands clenched into fists, but he forced a smile. You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Marple. I was in London, as I said. Check the ticket. Ask the station master. I couldn't have been here when my uncle died. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. Oh, I believe you were in London. Tickets don't lie, after all. But they don't tell the whole story, do they? A man can be in two places at once. In a manner of speaking, if he has help, Eleanor's breath caught. Help? What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes softened as she looked at Eleanor. I mean, my dear, that sometimes people act on behalf of others. Roger's alibi is solid, but alibis can be arranged. I wonder, Roger, who might have been here in your stead? Someone you trust, perhaps. Roger's laugh was harsh, almost desperate. This is absurd. You're spinning tales out of nothing. I've had enough of this. He strode toward the door, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him cold. One last thing, she said, holding up her knitting as if inspecting a stitch. The locket your uncle wore is missing, you know. The Jeweler said you asked about it. Claimed it was a family heirloom. Curious, since it held a key. The same key, perhaps. That unlocked the study. And something far more dangerous. Roger turned, his face a mask of barely contained fury. You're meddling in things you don't understand. Old woman. Leave it alone. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Eleanor stared after him, her hands trembling. Miss Marple, she whispered. What have you found? Is Roger dangerous? Miss Marple set her knitting down, her expression grave but kind. I don't know yet, Eleanor. But I do know that truth has a way of slipping through the cracks, like light through a poorly drawn curtain. We'll find it, my dear. We always do. The rest of the day unfolded with a quiet intensity. Miss Marple returned to the village, her mind racing as she pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. Roger's alibi was airtight, corroborated by the train ticket and a telegram from his London associates. Yet, his evasiveness, the missing button, and his interest in the locket pointed to a deeper involvement. Miss Marple knew she needed more than suspicions, she needed proof. At the post office, she chatted with Mrs. Clary, the postmistress, whose memory for village comings and goings was sharper than a tack. Roger Thornton, Mrs. Clary said, adjusting her spectacles. He was in here the day after the squire died, sending a parcel to London. Looked like he hadn't slept a wink. A parcel? Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Did you see what it was? Mrs. Clary shook her head. Sealed tight, it was, but heavy for its size. He paid extra for express delivery. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her thoughts turning to Clara, the former maid with the red scarf. Clara had worked at Thornton Hall, had access to the squire's habits, and had admitted to spying for Roger. Could she have been his accomplice? The idea fit, like a key in a well-oiled lock, but Miss Marple needed to test it. She found Clara at the Black Swan Inn, polishing glasses behind the bar. The young woman's face paled at the sight of Miss Marple, her hands fumbling with a cloth. Miss Marple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? Just a word, my dear. Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool. The inn was quiet, the lunch crowd long gone. I've been thinking about Roger. He's a clever man, isn't he? Clever enough to be in London while something happened here. Clara's eyes darted to the door. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. You were fond of the squire, weren't you? Before he dismissed you. It must have hurt, being cast out like that. And Roger, well, he's charming when he wants to be. Did he ask you to do something for him? Something unwise? Clara's lips trembled, but she shook her head. I didn't do anything wrong. I swear it. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. Clara, my dear, I've seen many young women led astray by promises. If you helped Roger, even a little, it's better to tell me now. Secrets have a way of festering. Clara's resolve crumbled, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't know, she whispered. He said it was just papers, documents he needed from the study. I didn't know the squire would die. Miss Marple's heart sank, but her face remained calm. What did you do? Clara's voice was barely audible. I let him in. The night before he went to London. He said he needed to check something in the study. I had a key to spare from when I worked there. I didn't think it would hurt. And the locket? Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but firm. Did you see it? Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. It was on the squire's desk. Roger took it. Said it was his by right. I didn't know what was in it, I swear. Miss Marple patted her hand. Thank you, Clara. You've done the right thing. As she left the inn, Miss Marple's mind buzzed with new clarity. Roger's alibi held, but Clara's confession painted a different picture of men orchestrating events from afar, using others to do his bidding. The locket, the key, the ledger all pointed to a plan to secure the squire's fortune before it slipped through his fingers. But one question remained. How had the squire died? A heart attack seemed less likely by the hour. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her cottage fire, her knitting idle in her lap. The button, the ledger, Clara's tearful words, they formed a pattern like stitches in a complex design. Roger was no mere opportunist. He was a strategist, and a dangerous one. But he wasn't alone. Someone had torn that ledger page. Someone had moved in the shadows of Thornton Hall. And Miss Marple was determined to find them. She picked up her needles, her fingers moving with quiet precision. The truth, she knew, was like her knitting one, stitch at a time, until the whole picture emerged. Roger's alibi was a shield, but shields could crack. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was ready to find the fault lines. Chapter 9. Clara's confession. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the lace curtains of the village inn. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small, round table in the corner of the inn's tea room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a half-finished scarf spilling over her lap like a cascade of lavender wool. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying a quiet cup of tea, her eyes soft and unassuming behind her spectacles. But those who knew her better, those who had seen the glint of steel beneath her gentle demeanor, would recognize the sharp mind at work, piecing together the puzzle of Squire Thornton's death. Across the room, Clara Henshaw, the former maid of Thornton Hall, bustled about, her apron slightly askew, her auburn hair pinned haphazardly beneath a white cap. The young woman's movements were quick, almost frantic, as she cleared teacups and wiped down tables, her eyes darting nervously toward Miss Marple every few moments. The air was thick with the scent of scones and bergamot, but beneath the cozy ambience, a current of tension hummed, as palpable as the distant toll of the church bell. Miss Marple had chosen this moment deliberately. The tea room was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple sharing a pot of Darjeeling near the window, their murmurs too low to carry. Clara had no excuse to avoid her, no crowd to hide behind. Miss Marple's earlier inquiries had unsettled the girl. Her evasive answers about the red scarf and her time at Thornton Hall had only deepened the old lady's suspicions. Now, with Roger Thornton's alibi holding but his motives growing clearer, Miss Marple needed Clara to speak plainly. The brass key, the locket, the ledger all pointed to a web of deceit, and Clara was entangled in it, whether by choice or coercion. "Clara, dear," Miss Marple called softly, her voice as warm as the tea steaming in her cup. "Might you spare a moment? My old hands aren't what they used to be, and I could use a bit of help with this knot." Clara froze mid-step, a rag clutched tightly in her hand. Her freckled cheeks flushed, and for a moment it seemed she might bolt. But Miss Marple's smile, gentle yet insistent, held her in place. With a hesitant nod, Clara approached her, steps slow, as if each one required a decision. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt beside the table, her fingers trembling as she reached for the tangled wool. "It's just a small knot, isn't it?" "Oh, quite small," Miss Marple agreed, her tone light. "But the smallest things can cause the most trouble, can't they? A tiny knot in a skein, a single word out of place, or a secret kept too long." Clara's hands stilled, her eyes fixed on the wool. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. The girl was no hardened criminal. That much was clear. Her fear was raw, her guilt a heavy cloak she wore poorly. I don't know what you mean, miss, Clara murmured, but her voice cracked. Betraying her. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap. Clara, my dear, I've lived long enough to know when someone is carrying a burden. You're not yourself today. Your eyes keep wandering to the door, as if you expect someone to come through it. Or perhaps you're afraid they will. Clara's head snapped up, her green eyes wide with panic. I'm not afraid of anything, she said too quickly. I've done nothing wrong. Of course not, Miss Marple said soothingly. But sometimes, doing nothing wrong can still feel like a weight, can't it? Especially when you've seen something, or done something for someone else, thinking it harmless at the time. Clara's hands twisted the rag, her knuckles white. You're talking about the squire, aren't you? I told you. I don't know anything about his death. I wasn't even at the hall that night. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly concern. But you were near the hall, weren't you? Old Tom saw you, or at least a woman in a red scarf, and you admitted to spying for Roger Thornton. Helping him with certain documents, perhaps. Clara's breath hitched, and she glanced toward the elderly couple, who were now engrossed in their scones, oblivious to the drama unfolding across the room. I didn't spy, she whispered fiercely. I passed along what I heard. Roger said it was to protect the squire, to keep an eye on his business dealings. I thought I was helping. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. And what did you hear, Clara? What did Roger ask you to do? Clara's shoulders slumped, and she sank into the chair opposite Miss Marple, as if the weight of her secrets had finally pulled her down. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The old lady leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. Tell me, Clara, tell me everything. You'll feel better for it, and I promise I'll listen without judgment. For a moment, Clara said nothing, her gaze fixed on the table, where a faint ring from a teacup stained the wood. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words spilled out, halting at first, then rushing like a river. It started months ago, she began. Before the squire dismissed me, I was cleaning the study, and I overheard him talking to someone on the telephone. He was angry, shouting about money, large sums, investments that had gone wrong. He mentioned a ledger, said it was proof of something dangerous. I didn't understand it all, but I told Roger because he asked me to. He said he was worried about his uncle, that the squire was in over his head with bad people. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained encouraging. And Roger paid you for this information? Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing with shame. A little. Just enough to help with my mother's medicine. She's been poorly, and the squire wasn't paying me much. Roger said it was a small thing, just keeping him informed. But then he asked me to do more. To copy papers from the squire's desk. Papers? Miss Marple prompted gently. What kind of papers? Clara swallowed hard. Ledgers, mostly. Lists of numbers, names. Of companies I'd never heard of. Roger said they were for the squire's investments, but he needed copies to make sure everything was legal. I didn't know how to read them properly, but I copied what I could. I used a pencil and tracing paper. Late at night when the squire was asleep, I'd slip into the study and take what Roger needed. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the dots. The torn ledger page she'd found in the library, marked with large sums, must have been one of Clara's copies, or perhaps the original, discarded in haste. And did Roger tell you why he needed these copies? She asked. Clara shook her head. He said it was to protect the squire, but I started to wonder. He was so eager, always asking for more. And then, the night the squire died, her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Go on, Clara, Miss Marple urged, her tone as steady as a lighthouse in a storm. What happened that night? Clara took a shuddering breath. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd been dismissed weeks before, but Roger asked me to meet him near the hall. He said he needed one last document, something urgent. I wore my red scarf because it was cold, and I waited by the study window, like he told me to. I saw the squire inside, sitting at his desk, drinking his tea. He looked tired, not himself. Then he clutched his chest and fell forward. I was so scared, I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her voice calm. And Roger, where was he? He was there, Clara whispered. He came out of the shadows right after the squire collapsed. He told me to stay quiet, to go home and say nothing. He said the squire had a weak heart, that it was natural. But then I saw him. He leaned over the squire, and he took something from his neck. It was the locket, the one the squire always wore. Roger opened it, and I saw a glint of metal inside a small brass key. He pocketed it and told me to forget everything. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup, though her face betrayed no emotion. The locket, the key, Roger's presence at the scene, it all fit together, like the final stitches in a pattern. And did you forget, Clara? She asked quietly. Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I tried to. I wanted to believe it was just a heart attack, like everyone said. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the squire looked, the way Roger acted. It wasn't right. I didn't know he was going to die, Miss Marple. I swear it. I thought I was just helping Roger. Not killing anyone. Miss Marple reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on Clara's arm. I believe you, my dear, she said softly. You were caught in something much bigger than you realized. But you've done the right thing now, telling me. The truth has a way of coming out, like a weed pushing through cracks in a path. Clara sniffled, wiping her eyes with the rag. What will happen to me, Miss Marple? Will I go to prison? Miss Marple's smile was kind but firm. That depends on what you do next. The police will need to know what you've told me, but I'll speak to Inspector Craddock. He's a fair man, and he'll see you were misled. You didn't poison the squire, Clara. You didn't know what Roger was planning. Poison? Clara's eyes widened, her voice a gasp. You think the squire was poisoned? Miss Marple hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I think it's possible, yes. The squire's death was too convenient for Roger. And that key, it's the key to everything, isn't it? The safe, the will, the ledger, all of it points to a man who wanted to control his uncle's fortune. Clara nodded, slowly, her face pale. The safe. Roger kept asking about it, saying the squire was hiding something valuable. I thought it was just money, but now, I don't know. Miss Marple patted her hand. You've been very brave, Clara. Now, I need you to be brave. A little longer. Stay here at the inn, go about your work, and don't speak to Roger. He mustn't know we've talked. Clara nodded, her expression resolute despite her fear. I won't say a word, Miss Marple. I promise. As Clara rose to return to her duties, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind whirring. Clara's confession had confirmed her suspicions. Roger Thornton had orchestrated the squire's death, using Clara as an unwitting pawn. The locket, with its hidden key, was the linchpin, and Roger's theft of it pointed to his desperation to access the safe. But the question remained. What exactly was in that safe? The new will, perhaps, or evidence of the squire's shady investments, and had Roger acted alone? Or was there another accomplice lurking in the shadows of St. Mary Mead? The tea room grew quieter as the elderly couple departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She sipped her tea, now cold, and resumed her knitting, the needles moving with a steady rhythm. To an outsider, she was just an old lady, lost in her craft. But within her sharp mind, the threads of the mystery were weaving together, each clue a stitch in a tapestry that would soon reveal the truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in twilight, Miss Marple made a mental note to visit the vicar next. The squire's letter, with its mention of a guardian for the key, intrigued her. And then there was the dog loyal, ever present, and perhaps the keeper of a secret even Roger hadn't anticipated. With a small, satisfied smile, Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, ready to follow the next thread in the unraveling mystery of Thornton Hall. Chapter 10. The vicar's inside late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient yews that guarded the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat perched neatly atop her silver hair, walked with a measured step along the gravel path leading to the vicarage. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a comforting weight, though her mind was far from the soft clack of needles. The mystery of Squire Thornton's death had deepened, and each clue she uncovered seemed to knot the threads tighter rather than unravel them. The brass key, the locket, the shadowy figure in the library, and now Clara's tearful confession about Roger's scheming, it all pointed to a truth buried beneath layers of deceit. Today, she hoped the vicar, Mr. Clement, might hold a piece of the puzzle. The vicarage door stood ajar, a sign of Mr. Clement's welcoming nature. Miss Marple knocked lightly, her sharp eyes catching the flutter of a curtain in the parlor window. A moment later, the vicar appeared, his round face flushed from tending his roses. Miss Marple, what a delight, he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. Do come in. I was just battling a particularly stubborn aphid. She smiled, her expression warm but her gaze keen. I shan't keep you long, Mr. Clement. I've come about a matter concerning Squire Thornton. His eyes widened slightly, and he ushered her into the parlor, where a tray of tea sat waiting, as if he'd anticipated her visit. The squire? Yes, dreadful business. The village hasn't stopped talking about it. Biscuit? Miss Marple declined, with a polite wave, settling into a chintz-covered chair. I understand the squire was a regular visitor here. Did he ever confide in you about his troubles? Mr. Clement poured tea, his hands steady, but his brow creased. He did, though, not in the way most do. The squire wasn't one for unburdening his soul. But a few weeks before his passing, he came to me with a letter. He paused, glancing toward a mahogany desk in the corner. He asked me to keep it safe, said it was important. I didn't think much of it at the time. People often entrust me with odd things, but now... Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A letter? Might I see it? The vicar hesitated, then crossed to the desk, unlocking a drawer with a small key. He withdrew an envelope, its edges worn, but sealed with red wax bearing the Thornton crest. He asked me not to open it unless something happened to him. I suppose now qualifies. He handed it to her, and Miss Marple's fingers traced the wax, noting its unbroken state. You've kept his trust admirably, she said, her voice soft but encouraging. Shall we open it together? Mr. Clement nodded, and with a gentle crack, the seal broke. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, the squire's handwriting bold but hurried. Miss Marple read aloud, her voice clear in the quiet room, too. Whom it may concern, I, Edward Thornton, write this to set matters straight. My nephew, Roger, has shown himself unworthy of the Thornton name. His greed has led him to schemes that shame me. I've rewritten my will to reflect my true wishes, and the key to my intentions lies with its guardian. Should I meet an untimely end, let this letter guide the just. She paused, her eyes meeting the vicar's. The guardian of the key, she murmured. Did he say anything about this guardian? Mr. Clement rubbed his chin, his gaze distant. Not directly, but he mentioned his dog, Brutus, more than once. Said that old hound was the only one he could trust. I thought it a jest, but now I wonder. Miss Marple's mind sparked. Brutus, the squire's loyal retriever, had been a constant presence. In village tales, always at the squire's side, his golden fur a familiar sight. Could the dog hold a clue? She thanked the vicar, tucking the letter into her bag, and stepped back into the sunlight, her thoughts racing. The Thornton estate was a short walk, and Miss Marple found Brutus dozing on the lawn, his collar glinting. In the sun, Eleanor, the squire's widow, greeted her at the gate, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple, you're becoming a regular visitor. Is something amiss? Not amiss, merely curious. Miss Marple replied, her tone light. Might I have a closer look at Brutus? He's such a fine dog. Eleanor nodded, puzzled, and called Brutus over. The retriever bounded up, his tail wagging. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the leather collar. It was sturdy, embossed with the Thornton crest, but something caught her eye, a small, stiff section near the buckle. She pressed gently, and to her surprise, a tiny compartment sprang open, barely larger than a thimble. It was empty. Dear me, she said, straightening. Eleanor, has anyone tampered with Brutus's collar recently? Eleanor frowned. Not that I know of. Roger took him for a walk a few days before Edward's death. Said it would do the old boy good. Why? Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Just a thought. Thank you, my dear. As she walked back to the village, the empty compartment gnawed at her. The squire's letter, the guardian, the collar, it all fit. Yet the key was still missing. Roger's involvement was undeniable, but the how and why remained elusive. She decided to revisit the village hall, where the photograph of the squire and his watch chain had first caught her attention. The hall was quiet, save for Mrs. Price, the caretaker, dusting the display case. Back again, Miss Marple, she said, her eyes twinkling. That photo's become quite the attraction. Miss Marple chuckled. It's a fine piece of history. Tell me, do you recall anyone else taking an interest in it? Mrs. Price thought for a moment. Well, Roger was here a week ago, asking about old family portraits. Said he was researching the Thornton lineage. He lingered by that photo a good while. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions tightening. She examined the photograph again, noting the squire's proud stance, the brass key dangling from his watch chain. But something new caught her eye, a faint reflection in the glass behind him, showing a figure in a red scarf. Clara, or someone else. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her cottage fire, knitting forgotten as she pieced together the clues. The letter confirmed Roger's motive disinheritance. The empty collar suggested he'd already retrieved the key, but the red scarf in the photograph hinted at another player, someone who'd watched the squire closely. She resolved to visit Clara again, but first, she needed to confirm the collar's significance. The next morning, she returned to Thornton Hall, this time with a small magnifying glass tucked in her bag. Brutus greeted her with a woof, and Eleanor, sensing her purpose, allowed her to examine the collar again, under the glass. Miss Marple found faint scratches inside the compartment, as if a small object had been pried out. The key, she was certain, had been there. Eleanor, she said. Did the squire ever mention hiding something with Brutus? Eleanor shook her head. He was fond of that dog, but he never said anything about hiding things, though. He did joke once that Brutus was his best secret keeper. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A wise man. Your husband. Her next stop was the village blacksmith, Mr. Hargreaves, who crafted custom fittings for the Thornton estate. Miss Marple, he boomed, wiping soot from his hands. What brings you to my forge? I'm curious about a collar, she said. The squire's dog, Brutus, did you ever make anything special for it? Hargreaves grinned. I did. A year back, the squire asked for a collar with a hidden pocket. Said it was for a keepsake, nothing valuable. I thought it odd, but he paid well. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Did anyone else know about this? Not from me, Hargreaves said, though Roger was around when I delivered it. He seemed mighty curious. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid out the clues. The squire's letter, the empty collar, Roger's interest, the red scarf in the photograph. The key had been hidden with Brutus, but Roger had found it, likely during that walk. The question was, had he used it yet? The safe in the study remained unopened, but the ledger's torn page suggested he'd been searching for something else. Perhaps proof of the squire's new will. She decided to test a theory. Inviting Clara for tea, she arranged her parlor to appear casual, but her questions were anything but. Clara, she began, pouring tea. You mentioned seeing Roger take the locket. Did you ever see him with Brutus? Clara's hands trembled slightly. Once, yes. The day before the squire died. He was fiddling with the dog's collar, muttering about getting what's mine. I thought he was just petting him. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And the red scarf, did you wear it that day? Clara paled. No. I lost it weeks before. Someone must have found it. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind racing. The scarf in the photograph wasn't Clara's, it was a plant meant to mislead. Roger had orchestrated a web of misdirection, but the collar's empty compartment was the key to unraveling it. She thanked Clara and sent her off, her resolve firm. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village quiet save for the distant bark of a dog. Brutus, the guardian, had held the key, and Roger had stolen it. But the safe, the will, and the truth remained just out of reach. Tomorrow, she would confront Roger not directly, but through the village's watchful eyes, where secrets never stayed buried long. Chapter 11. The poisoned glass. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Thornton Hall, its golden light doing little to warm the chill that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her navy coat buttoned against the autumn breeze, stood at the threshold of the squire's study, a room that had remained locked since Archibald Thornton's death 3 weeks prior. The heavy oak door, now ajar, seemed to exhale secrets as she stepped inside. Her sensible shoes silented the polished floorboards. Eleanor Thornton, the squire's widow, hovered behind her, wringing her hands, her pale face a map of worry and grief. Thank you for allowing me to look. Mrs. Thornton, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. I know it's painful to revisit this room. Eleanor nodded, her eyes darting to the desk where her husband had been found. It's just so hard, Miss Marple. I keep thinking he'll walk through that door, barking orders about the estate. But now, with Roger here and all this talk of a key, her voice trailed off, trembling. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch as reassuring as her demeanor was unassuming. We'll get to the bottom of it, my dear. Sometimes the smallest details light the way. The study was a time capsule of the squire's life, shelves lined with leather-bound books, a mahogany desk cluttered with papers, and a single crystal tumbler glinting in the fading light. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, lingered on that tumbler. It sat alone on a silver tray, its contents long evaporated, but a faint ring of residue clung to its base. She had seen such glasses before, in drawing rooms and parlors, but this one held her attention like a clue in a novel she was yet to finish. The past days had woven a complex tapestry of suspicion. The missing brass key, once dangling from the squire's watch chain, had sparked whispers of foul play. Roger Thornton, the squire's estranged nephew, had returned to St. Mary Mead, his nervous inquiries and late-night prowling raising Miss Marple's suspicions. Clara, the former maid, had confessed to spying for Roger, and the discovery of a hidden safe behind a portrait had hinted at secrets worth killing for. Most recently, the vicar's letter had revealed the squire's intent to disinherit Roger, and a dog's collar empty of its hidden key had deepened the mystery. Now, Miss Marple stood in the heart of the puzzle. Determined to find the thread that would unravel it all, she approached the desk, her knitting bag slung over her arm, and leaned closer to the tumbler. A faint, bitter scent lingered, almost masked by the musty air of the sealed room. "Mrs. Thornton," she said, turning slightly, "did your husband often drink from this glass?" Eleanor frowned, stepping closer. "Yes. He liked his evening whiskey. He'd sit here, reading his papers, sipping from that very tumbler." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind racing. "It's curious, isn't it? A glass left out, when the rest of the room is so tidy." She glanced at the neatly stacked papers, the polished inkstand, the absence of dust, almost as if it was meant to be noticed. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You don't think... Surely it's just a glass, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone light, but her gaze intent. She reached into her bag, retrieving a small handkerchief, and carefully lifted the tumbler, wrapping it to preserve whatever traces remained. "But I like to have it looked at, if you don't mind. A friend of mine, Mr. Haverford, is a chemist in the next town. He's terribly clever with these things." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "If you think it's important, I trust you." "But what are you looking for?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. "Answers, my dear. Just answers." The journey to Mr. Haverford's shop in Upper Darrowby was a pleasant one. The bus rolling through lanes lined with hawthorn hedges and sheep-dotted fields. Miss Marple sat by the window, the wrapped tumbler nestled in her bag, her thoughts weaving through the clues she'd gathered. The squire's death, ruled a heart attack, had seemed straightforward until the key's disappearance and Roger's return stirred doubts. The ledger page, torn and marked with large sums, suggested financial motives, while Clara's confession pointed to Roger's involvement. But it was the vicar's letter, with its mention of a new will, that had shifted her focus. A heart attack could be natural or induced, and that glass, with its bitter scent, was the first tangible link to something sinister. Mr. Haverford's shop, tucked between a bakery and a haberdashery, was a cluttered den of glass vials and bubbling flasks. The chemist, a weary man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. What's this you've brought me? Not another case of poisoned jam, I hope?" she chuckled, setting the tumbler on his counter. "Nothing so domestic, Mr. Haverford. I'd like you to examine this glass. There's a residue inside, and I suspect it's not just whiskey." His eyebrows rose, but he took the glass with professional curiosity, holding it to the light. "A faint discoloration, and that smell, bitter, you say?" He uncorked a vial of solution and began his tests, muttering to himself as he worked. Miss Marple watched patiently, her hands folded over her bag, her mind replaying the scene. In the study, after an hour, Mr. Haverford turned to her, his face grave. Digitalis, Miss Marple. Foxglove extract, to be precise. A heart medication in small doses. But in excess, he shook his head. It could stop a heart cold. No prescription for this at Thornton Hall. I take it. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. None that I'm aware of. The squire was healthy, by all accounts, until that night. Haverford nodded, wiping his hands. Then you've got a problem on your hands. This wasn't an accident. Someone dosed his drink. She thanked him, tucking the glass back into her bag. The return journey felt heavier, the countryside blurring past as her thoughts sharpened. Digitalis explained the squire's collapse, the suddenness of his death. But who had access to his whiskey? Eleanor. Who lived at the hall? Roger. Who had been seen near the study? Or Clara? Who knew the squire's habits? The key, she sensed, was tied to this act. Perhaps it unlocked the proof of who had poisoned him. Back in St. Mary Mead, the village was abuzz with preparations for the harvest festival. Bunting strung across the high street and children carrying baskets of apples. Miss Marple, however, deeded to the Red Lion, the local pub where Roger had been asking questions. The landlord, Mr. Gibbs, was polishing glasses behind the bar, his ruddy face creased with a grin as she entered. Miss Marple, not often we see you here. Care for a sherry? Perhaps a lemonade, Mr. Gibbs, she said, settling onto a stool. I was wondering if you'd seen Mr. Roger Thornton lately. I hear he's been curious about his uncle's affairs. Gibbs snorted, pouring her drink. Curious, downright nosy, if you ask me. In here 2 nights ago, asking about the squire's visitors, his habits, even what he drank. Kept eyeing the whiskey bottle on the shelf like it owed him money. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her mind ticking. Did he mention a glass? By any chance? Or a key? Gibbs frowned, scratching his chin. Not a key, no. But he did ask if the squire ever brought his own tumbler to the hall's parties. Odd question. I told him the squire always drank from his own crystal. Glass fussy about it. He was. She nodded, her suspicion growing. Roger's interest in the tumbler suggested he knew its significance. Had he laced the whiskey, then ensured the glass remained to avoid suspicion? Or was he checking to see if his plan had been discovered? As she left the pub, the village clock struck 5, its chimes mingling with the laughter of festival goers. Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful, her mind weaving the new clue into the pattern. The digitalis confirmed murder, and the tumbler pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the squire's habits. Roger remained the prime suspect, but she couldn't ignore Eleanor's access or Clara's bitterness. The key, she sensed, would unlock not just the safe but the killer's identity. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered. The tumbler was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. Digitalis wasn't easy to come by. It required knowledge of plants or access to a pharmacy. She recalled the squire's garden filled with foxgloves, their purple bells swaying in the breeze. Anyone at the hall could have extracted the poison, but the precision suggested intent. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Bantry, her friend from the village, her face flushed with excitement. Jane, you'll never guess. I was at the hall today, helping Eleanor with the festival committee, and I saw something odd in the greenhouse. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her interest piqued. Do tell, Dolly. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a stage whisper. There's a corner of the greenhouse hidden behind some ferns. with a little workbench. I found a mortar and pestle stained purple and a jar labeled foxglove essence. I thought it was for gardening, but now I'm not so sure. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Indeed. That's most interesting. Did anyone see you there? Not a soul, Mrs. Bantry said, but Roger was lurking about the hall, looking like he'd lost a shilling and found a penny. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The greenhouse was a new piece of the puzzle. Linking the poison to the hall itself, she resolved to visit it tomorrow, perhaps under the pretense of admiring Eleanor's roses. The festival would provide cover, with the village distracted by games and stalls as Mrs. Bantry left. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. The tumbler had confirmed murder, and the greenhouse hinted at preparation. Roger's questions at the pub, Clara's knowledge of the squire's habits, and Eleanor's access to the hall all wove together. But the key remained the missing thread. It was out there, she was certain, waiting to unlock the final truth. Satisfying end, the discovery of digitalis in the tumbler was a turning point, transforming suspicion into certainty. The squire had been murdered, and the poison, likely prepared in the greenhouse, pointed to someone close to the hall. Miss Marple tucked the glass back into her bag, her resolve strengthened. Tomorrow, she would explore the greenhouse, and the next clue, perhaps the key itself, would bring her closer to unmasking the killer.